My son looked me dead in the eye at my granddaughter's wedding, signaled to his security guards, and told 400 of the city's most powerful people that I was losing my mind and had to be removed from the property. He thought he was putting the final nail in the coffin of a weak, grieving old man. He had absolutely no idea that his little public stunt was the exact mistake I needed him to make. My name is Edgar Jenkins. I am 70 years old. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my own son's life and exposed his $80 million lie, tell me where you are listening from in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your family exactly who built the table they are sitting at. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Astoria ballroom stood 10 feet tall, slightly ajar, letting the soft notes of a string quartet drift out into the marble hallway. I stood there holding a small velvet box in my right hand. Inside rested a flawless diamond necklace. I had purchased that necklace 40 years ago with my very first major corporate dividend. I made a promise to my late wife Evelyn before she passed away last year. I promised her that our granddaughter Haley would wear this exact necklace on her wedding day. My hands did not shake as I reached out to push the brass handle of the door. I was ready to celebrate. But before my fingers could even brush the cold metal, a heavy hand slammed flat against the polished wood right in front of me, forcing the door completely shut. I looked up. My son Jared stood there blocking my path. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit him perfectly. His jaw was set tight and the muscles in his neck flexed with an aggressive, rehearsed tension. His eyes, the same dark eyes he inherited from his mother, held absolutely zero warmth. He looked at me not as a father, but as a nuisance, a stray dog that had wandered onto a private estate. I took a slow breath, holding the velvet box a little tighter, waiting for him to step aside so I could see my granddaughter. But Jared did not move an inch. "You need to turn around and go home right now, Dad." Jared stated this with a voice that was perfectly calibrated to carry over the quiet chatter of the lobby. He wanted people to hear. I looked past his broad shoulder through the glass panes of the adjoining reception hall. 400 guests sat at tables draped in pristine white silk. The elite of the city investors, politicians, people I had done business with for decades were all turning their heads to watch us. Through the crowd, I saw Rachel, my daughter-in-law, standing near a towering champagne fountain. She swirled her crystal glass-locked eyes with me and offered a thin, venomous smirk. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. "I am here to give Haley her grandmother's necklace," I replied. My voice remained perfectly level, calm, and reasonable. Jared crossed his arms over his chest and scoffed loudly. "You are not on the guest list," he declared, raising his volume just enough to ensure the nearest tables heard every humiliating word. "Haley does not want you ruining her photos. You have been completely confused lately, Dad. You are wandering around like you do not know where you are. You are an embarrassment to yourself and to this family. If you do not leave quietly right now, my security team will physically escort you to your car." He snapped his fingers. On cue, two massive men wearing dark earpieces stepped out from the shadows of the coat check. They flanked me immediately, standing mere inches away, treating me like a violent trespasser on private property. The absolute audacity of the scene washed over me like a freezing wave. I looked at the security guards. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from my son's face. Any other man might have yelled, any other father might have thrown a punch, screamed about disrespect, or caused the exact kind of hysterical scene Jared was desperately hoping for. But I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I utilized silent, calculated observation. I looked Jared directly in the eyes, and I saw the arrogant, reckless certainty of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war. He actually believed I was a senile, expiring resource. He conveniently forgot that I single-handedly built the global logistics empire that paid for the very tuxedo he was wearing. I funded the massive 8-figure trust account that was currently paying for the caviar and the champagne fountain his wife was leaning against. I am the architect of his entire reality. "I understand," I said quietly. I turned my back on my own flesh and blood. I walked out of the opulent lobby, the heavy doors shutting behind me, effectively sealing me out of my only family. I stepped out into the freezing night air. The crisp wind bit at my face, but my mind had never been clearer. I handed my parking ticket to the valet and stood under the glowing amber lights of the hotel canopy. As I waited for the young man to bring around my vintage sedan, I felt a sharp, sudden vibration in the inner pocket of my coat. It was not a phone call. It was a specific high-priority alert rhythm that I had programmed myself. I pulled my phone out and stared at the illuminated screen. It was an automated top-tier security alert from the internal servers of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping. The text glared at me in stark red letters. Master override initiated. Financial authorization transferred to Jared Jenkins. The notification sat heavily in my hand, illuminating the dark truth of the entire evening. The humiliation at the ballroom doors was not just about cruelty or embarrassment. The wedding was a meticulously timed decoy. It was a massive, expensive spectacle designed to keep me occupied, isolated, and publicly discredited as mentally unstable. While I was standing in a lobby being flanked by rented security guards, Jared was miles away, electronically hijacking my corporate accounts. He was using a backdoor exploit I thought I had sealed years ago. He wanted everyone to see me as a confused old man who got turned away from a party so no one would question his sudden assumption of emergency financial control. The valet pulled up to the curb, leaving the engine running. He opened the door for me. I handed him a crisp $20 bill, slid into the leather driver's seat, and closed the door. I did not put the car in gear to drive toward my empty, quiet house in the suburbs. I gripped the steering wheel, checked my rearview mirror, and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. I drove directly toward the towering glass skyscraper of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping, located in the heart of the financial district. Jared thought he had successfully neutralized me with a public shaming. He did not realize that he had just fired the opening shot of a war that would ultimately leave him with absolutely nothing. The glass and steel monolith of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping pierced the cold night sky. I parked my vintage sedan in the VIP underground garage, a space I had personally paved the foundation for 35 years ago when this company was nothing but 5 cargo trucks and a dream. The garage was entirely empty, echoing with the low hum of the massive ventilation system. I walked up to the private executive elevator and swiped my original founder's keycard. A harsh red light blinked on the scanner, followed by a sharp buzz. Access denied. Jared had worked fast. He truly believed he had locked the old man out of his own empire. He thought a simple digital firewall could keep me away from the legacy I built with my own hands. He forgot I designed the physical security architecture myself a decade ago. I turned my back on the elevator and walked down the concrete corridor toward the maintenance stairwell. The heavy steel door required a digital passcode, but underneath the keypad rested an analog fire override panel. I popped the metal cover off with my house key and punched in the 6-digit sequence from the 1980s. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud, satisfying clack. I pushed the door open and began the climb. 20 flights of concrete stairs stretched above me. My 70-year-old knees ached with every step, protesting the steep ascent. Yet the cold fury expanding in my chest pushed me forward, erasing the physical pain. I was not a frail old man wandering the streets. I was the founder returning to reclaim his territory. I reached the executive floor, my breathing heavy but completely steady. The glass double doors leading to the inner sanctum were locked tight. I bypassed the digital scanner entirely, slipping my physical master key into the hidden mechanical cylinder at the base of the handle. I stepped into Jared's spacious corner office. The room immediately assaulted my senses with the smell of expensive scotch, imported leather, and sheer arrogance. I walked straight to his massive mahogany desk and booted up his desktop computer. While the screen glowed to life, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. Willis, my fiercely loyal head of corporate IT, had given me this decryption drive months ago when he first noticed irregularities in the logistics budget. I plugged the drive into the port. The password prompt vanished instantly, overridden by Willis's backdoor protocol. The files decrypted in exactly 4 minutes. I opened the main financial ledger, expecting to find bad investments or careless spending. The numbers staring back at me told a story of sheer, unadulterated desperation. Jared had not just transferred operational control to fuel his luxurious lifestyle. He was actively draining the corporate reserves to cover a massive hemorrhaging wound. Over the past 8 months, he had diverted $12 million to a shadow account in the Cayman Islands. I traced the routing numbers through the encrypted ledger. The money was not going to legitimate business partners. Jared was deeply indebted to a dangerous offshore syndicate known for hostile takeovers and aggressive debt collection. My son was not a master businessman. He was a drowning coward, stealing his father's lifeblood to appease loan sharks. The sheer magnitude of his financial incompetence was staggering. He had leveraged my ships, my warehouses, and my name. I dug deeper into his personal, highly restricted folders following the digital trail of his absolute panic. I needed to know exactly how he planned to cover a $12 million deficit before the board of directors demanded a full audit. I found a subfolder labeled Medical. The title made 0 sense in a corporate financial ledger. I clicked the icon. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Displayed on the high-resolution monitor was a fully drafted, legally binding petition for involuntary conservatorship. Jared and Rachel were actively filing documents with the state to declare me legally incompetent. I scrolled through the attached medical evaluation. The paperwork detailed a fabricated history of erratic behavior claiming I suffered from severe advanced Alzheimer's disease. The doctor's signature at the bottom of the page belonged to a Dr. Wyatt Mercer, a man I had never met or spoken to in my entire life. Jared needed me declared insane to seize control of the $80 million Founders Trust. That trust was the only asset large enough to pay off his offshore creditors and save his own skin. If he did not secure those funds, the syndicate would completely dismantle his life. The humiliation at the ballroom doors suddenly crystallized into perfect, horrifying focus. The wedding was not just cruelty or a pathetic ego trip. It was a calculated move to isolate me from my allies and make me look wildly erratic and confused to the public. He needed wealthy witnesses to testify that I wandered into a party uninvited, babbling about a necklace. Jared intended to lock me inside a secure asylum, strip me of my human rights, and liquidate my legacy while I rotted in a sterile room. A sharp mechanical beep shattered the silence of the empty office. The high-end laser printer in the corner of the room suddenly whirred to life. Paper fed through the tray, the ink rollers working furiously. Jared was operating remotely from the wedding reception. While he was toasting his daughter and drinking my champagne, he was utilizing his newly hijacked executive access to finalize his theft. I walked over to the printer tray and picked up the warm, freshly printed document. It was a formal wire transfer authorization. He was moving another $4 million to the Cayman account. The transfer was scheduled to execute the exact second the banks opened on Monday morning. This was his final lifeline to the syndicate. I folded the paper meticulously and placed it in my jacket pocket right alongside Evelyn's velvet box. I did not need to confront him tonight. Confrontation would only give him time to hide his tracks and call his lawyers. I pulled a microfiber cloth from the desk drawer and carefully wiped my fingerprints from the keyboard, the mouse, and the edge of the desk. I left the office exactly as I had found it, locking the glass doors behind me. I walked back down the 20 flights of concrete stairs, the absolute silence of the building mirroring the absolute stillness in my mind. I drove back to my house through the dark, empty city streets. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my living room watching the moonlight filter through the blinds. I analyzed every variable, calculating the exact pressure points required to crush his conspiracy. My son believed he was playing a game of chess against a ghost. He was about to learn what happens when the ghost fights back. The heavy rain of Sunday morning drummed a relentless rhythm against the expansive bay windows of my suburban estate. I had not slept a single minute. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee when the crunch of tires on gravel broke through the sound of the storm. I did not need to look at the security monitors to know who had just pulled past my wrought iron gates. Jared and Rachel stepped out of their sleek silver luxury vehicle holding a large umbrella and carrying a decorative wicker basket of fresh blueberry muffins. They were aggressively playing the role of the incredibly devoted, deeply concerned family dropping in to check on their ailing patriarch. I took a slow breath, centering my mind and burying my rage deep in my chest. It was time to give them exactly what they wanted. I unlocked the front door and walked back into the kitchen, waiting for them to enter. When Jared pushed the heavy oak door open and called out my name with fake, sugary sweetness, I picked up my coffee mug. I intentionally let my wrist tremble. I relaxed my grip just enough to let a splash of scalding dark liquid spill over the rim, pooling onto the pristine white marble counter. Jared walked into the kitchen, his designer shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He immediately spotted the puddle of spilled coffee and the slight tremor I was desperately pretending to fight. His face contorted into a mask of exaggerated, deeply rehearsed pity. "Dad, we were so incredibly worried about you last night," Jared said, setting his umbrella by the door. "You wandered off before the wedding ceremony even started. We could not find you anywhere." He was gaslighting me right to my face. He was actively building the narrative of my mental decline, laying the groundwork for the judge. "I was at the ballroom doors, Jared," I said, keeping my voice intentionally frail and uncertain. "You told me I was not on the guest list." Rachel sighed dramatically, placing the basket of muffins on the counter next to my spilled coffee. Edgar Sweetie Jared was inside giving a toast to Haley. "You must have spoken to a confused security guard. Your memory is slipping again. We really need to get you proper help." Before I could answer, Jared suddenly sniffed the air and rushed over to the stainless steel gas range. He aggressively twisted one of the burner knobs. "Dad, you left the stove on overnight. The house could have exploded." I stared at him. I knew for an absolute fact that the stove had been completely off when they arrived. Jared had twisted it on himself with his back turned to me just seconds ago. As he turned around to scold me, I noticed a tiny pulsing red light peeking out of his tailored shirt pocket. His smartphone was recording. They were actively gathering audio evidence of my supposed confusion to present to the courts. I decided right then to hand them an absolute masterpiece. If they wanted a broken, hallucinating old man for their hidden microphone, I would give them a performance worthy of an Academy Award. I let my shoulders slump forward physically, shrinking my posture to look incredibly small and defeated. I stared blankly at the wall directly behind Rachel, widening my eyes in feigned terror. "Evelyn told me to bring the diamond necklace," I muttered, making my voice sound distant and thoroughly detached from reality. "She was just sitting here at the island this morning. She drank her tea and said Haley needed the necklace for the photos." The kitchen fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Jared's dark eyes instantly lit up with a flash of malicious, unfiltered victory. My beautiful wife, Evelyn, had been dead for over a year. Mentioning her as if she were casually sitting in my kitchen was the exact undeniable symptom of advanced dementia they desperately needed for their petition. "Dad, Mom is gone," Jared said. His voice dropped to a soft, agonizing whisper, leaning his chest forward so the microphone in his pocket would catch every single syllable. "You are completely hallucinating. This is exactly why Rachel brought a medical specialist to see you this afternoon. It is for your own good." I gripped the edge of the marble counter, letting my knuckles turn white, portraying a man utterly terrified of his own crumbling mind. "A specialist?" I asked, my voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable. "I do not need a doctor. I am perfectly fine. I just need to talk to Evelyn again." Rachel stepped forward, completely dropping the sweet, caring daughter-in-law facade. Her voice turned into an icy, absolute command. "He is already on his way, Edgar. You will sit quietly in the living room, and you will answer his questions. If you resist or try to wander off again, we will have no choice but to call the authorities. You are becoming a serious danger to yourself and to this neighborhood." I looked up at her, offering the pathetic, defeated nod they demanded. "Okay," I whispered, staring down at the floor. Satisfied that they had broken my spirit, Jared and Rachel grabbed their coffee mugs and walked out to the covered back patio to wait for their corrupt doctor. They genuinely believed I was a deaf, empty shell waiting to be hauled away. The exact second the sliding glass door clicked shut behind them, my trembling hands stopped completely. My posture straightened into the rigid stance of a corporate titan. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and quickly typed a secure text message to Willis, my fiercely loyal head of corporate technology. "The bait is taken. Prepare the surveillance feed in the living room." I had wired my entire estate with high-definition hidden cameras and audio receivers 6 months ago when Evelyn first fell ill, wanting to keep a close eye on her caregivers. I never deactivated a single lens. I walked silently into the living room and took my seat in my leather armchair, waiting for Dr. Wyatt Mercer to walk directly into the jaws of a federal trap. The doorbell echoed through the quiet house exactly 15 minutes later. Jared rushed to open it, his heavy footsteps thudding against the hardwood. He ushered Dr. Wyatt Mercer into my living room with the kind of frantic reverence usually reserved for royalty. I stayed seated in my leather armchair, studying the man who held the power to strip away my freedom with a single signature. Dr. Mercer did not look like any physician I had ever encountered during Evelyn's lengthy battles with illness. He wore a bespoke Italian suit of midnight blue wool, paired with a silk tie and a gold watch that caught the afternoon light. He carried no medical bag, no stethoscope, and no blood pressure cuff. His only tool was a sleek black leather briefcase. He did not introduce himself to me. He did not offer a comforting smile or a gentle handshake. He simply sat on the edge of the velvet sofa opposite my chair, unclasped his briefcase, and pulled out a single sheet of paper attached to a silver clipboard. Rachel hovered closely behind him, crossing her arms and watching me like a hawk. Jared stood near the doorway, blocking my only visible exit. Dr. Mercer clicked an expensive pen and looked at me with cold, dead eyes. He launched immediately into a rapid-fire cognitive assessment specifically engineered to confuse and disorient. He did not ask about my physical health or my current emotional state. He went straight for the kill. Edgar, your family has expressed deep concern regarding your recent memory lapses. Dr. Mercer stated, his tone flat and utterly devoid of medical empathy. Can you tell me what year it is? I stared down at my hands, letting them rest weakly on my lap. I knew exactly what year it was. I knew the exact closing price of my company's stock as of Friday afternoon, but I also knew exactly what response this corrupt physician had been paid to record. 1998. I lied smoothly, letting my voice trail off into a hollow whisper. Dr. Mercer did not flinch. He did not display a single ounce of clinical concern or surprise. He simply checked a box on his silver clipboard with a sharp flick of his wrist. Can you count backward from 100 by sevens, he demanded, firing the question so quickly that even a healthy mind might stumble. 90, I mumbled, staring blankly at a spot on the rug. 80, 50. Behind the sofa, Rachel let out a loud, theatrical sigh of despair. I saw Jared shift his weight, his shoulders visibly relaxing as he tasted his impending victory. Dr. Mercer stood up. The entire medical evaluation had taken exactly 4 minutes. He never checked my pupils. He never took my pulse. He never asked about my diet, my sleep schedule, or my hydration levels. The cognitive decline is profound and rapidly advancing. Dr. Mercer announced to Jared, addressing him as if I were a piece of broken furniture taking up space in the room. He requires immediate relocation to a secure memory care facility for his own safety. I have the involuntary commitment authorization papers ready for your final signature right here. He slid the clipboard toward my son. Jared took the pen, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline, and signed my legal rights away without a second thought. Thank you, Dr. Rachel said, stepping forward with an eager smile. We will step out into the hallway to handle the payment and finalize the transport logistics. The three of them turned their backs on me and walked out of the living room, leaving me alone in my armchair. They genuinely believed I was a broken, uncomprehending shell of a man entirely unaware of my surroundings. They had absolutely no idea that the hallway they had just stepped into was wired with a hidden high-definition camera and a highly sensitive audio receiver. The lens was perfectly concealed inside the casing of the smoke detector mounted directly above their heads. I slowly pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket, opened the encrypted application Willis had built for me, and watched the live feed. The camera angle provided a flawless, crystal-clear view of the transaction. Rachel reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope. She handed it directly to Dr. Mercer. $50,000 in cash, exactly as we agreed, Rachel whispered, her voice captured perfectly by the overhead microphone. The judge will approve the emergency conservatorship petition tomorrow morning based entirely on your signature. Make sure the facility director understands he must lock him in the secure ward immediately. Dr. Mercer took the heavy envelope, weighing it in his hand before sliding it smoothly into his sleek leather briefcase. The commitment papers are ironclad, Dr. Mercer replied, his tone laced with arrogant certainty. He will not be able to make a single phone call, sign a single check, or leave the premises without your explicit written permission. The asylum staff knows exactly what to do. Jared and Rachel walked back into the living room a moment later. The fake sympathy they had displayed earlier in the morning was completely gone. Jared looked down at me, his face hardened into a mask of absolute authority. Pack a bag right now, Dad, Jared ordered. His voice was a cold, sharp command stripped of any lingering affection. The medical transport team will be here tomorrow at dawn. You are leaving this house and you are not coming back. I looked up at him, forcing my eyes to widen in fabricated terror. I gave him the exact pathetic, defeated nod he demanded. Okay, Jared, I whispered, keeping my head bowed. Satisfied that my spirit was thoroughly broken, they turned around, walked out the front door, and drove away in their silver luxury vehicle, completely confident in their total victory. The exact second their car disappeared down the street, my posture straightened. I stood up and walked briskly to my private study. I securely downloaded the hallway surveillance footage directly to my encrypted flash drive. I grabbed a small leather duffel bag from the closet. I did not pack pajamas, slippers, or toiletries for an asylum. I packed 50 years of original corporate founding deeds, the authentic trust documents that legally proved my ownership, and my passport. I walked out the back door, locked it tightly, and stepped into the cold evening air. I got into my vintage sedan, started the engine, and drove away from my estate into the dark night. I was heading straight to the downtown office of Mr. Bradley, my ruthless corporate attorney. The silent correction was about to become a devastating storm. The glass doors of Bradley & Associates slid open to reveal a sprawling corner office bathed in the amber glow of the city skyline. I walked in and dropped my leather duffel bag onto the polished mahogany floor. Mr. Bradley sat behind his massive desk. He was a ruthless corporate attorney who had navigated the treacherous waters of international shipping law alongside me for 30 years. He did not ask how my evening was. He simply plugged my encrypted flash drive into his secure terminal and hit play on the surveillance footage. The high-definition video filled the large monitor mounted on his wall. We sat in total silence as the crisp audio captured every single word exchanged in my hallway. We watched Rachel hand Dr. Mercer the thick white envelope containing $50,000 in cash. We listened to them meticulously outline the plan to secure a fraudulent emergency conservatorship and lock me inside a secure memory care ward. Mr. Bradley leaned back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers. The soft glow of the monitor highlighted the deep lines of cold anger etched into his face. He paused the video exactly on the frame where the doctor slid the bribe into his briefcase. "This is not just a family dispute." Mr. Bradley stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "We are looking at criminal conspiracy, felony, elder abuse, medical malpractice, and massive corporate fraud. Jared is not just trying to take over the company, he is actively trying to erase you from society so he can liquidate your assets without interference. He needs the $80 million sitting in my founder's trust to pay off the massive debt he has accumulated," I explained. I reached into my jacket pocket, moving past Evelyn's velvet necklace box, and pulled out the folded sheet of paper I had intercepted from the executive printer. I flattened it out and slid it across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk. Jared has been bleeding the operational reserves dry for 8 months. He has already funneled $12 million to a shadow account in the Cayman Islands to appease a dangerous offshore syndicate. The board of directors is completely unaware of the deficit. Mr. Bradley picked up the document and adjusted his reading glasses. His eyes scanned the routing numbers and the forged executive authorizations. "Jared is terrified of his creditors." I continued pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This printed authorization proves he scheduled a final $4 million wire transfer to execute the exact second the international banks open on Monday morning. That transfer is his absolute last lifeline to keep the syndicate off his back. If he does not send that money, the loan sharks will tear his entire life apart." Mr. Bradley set the paper down and looked up at me with the sharp, predatory gaze of a lawyer preparing for a slaughter. "He intends to use your involuntary commitment as a shield," Mr. Bradley deduced instantly. "While you are strapped to a hospital bed screaming about stolen companies, he will claim emergency executive privilege and push the transfer through without raising any red flags with corporate compliance. We cannot wait for a judge to review this footage. We must sever his financial access right now." Mr. Bradley picked up his secure landline and bypassed his assistant completely. He dialed a direct unlisted number to the Federal Banking Commission that only a handful of top-tier corporate attorneys possessed. He placed the call on speakerphone. A federal agent answered on the second ring, confirming his identification code. "I need an immediate total asset freeze on all global accounts associated with Jenkins Worldwide Shipping," Mr. Bradley ordered with absolute authority. "Initiate an emergency lockdown on the primary founder's trust. The authorization code is Alpha 7. The reason is unauthorized executive access and suspected international wire fraud." The agent on the other end of the line typed furiously into a terminal. I stood by the window watching the taillights of cars moving through the dark streets far below, knowing that every keystroke the agent made was tightening an inescapable noose around my son's neck. The automated security protocols triggered across multiple global banking networks within seconds. The agent verbally confirmed that every single corporate account, offshore holding, and trust fund associated with Jared's credentials was now completely and irrevocably frozen. Any attempted transaction would trigger an automatic fraud alert directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jared's $4 million wire transfer was now guaranteed to bounce violently the moment the banking servers tried to process it in the morning. Mr. Bradley ended the call and firmly closed his laptop. "The financial hemorrhage is officially stopped," he confirmed. Your son has absolutely zero access to company capital. He cannot move a single dime, and he cannot access your trust to pay off the offshore syndicate. He is completely cut off from the oxygen that keeps his fraudulent lifestyle alive. The trap was flawlessly set. Jared would wake up on Monday morning expecting to finalize my committal to an asylum while simultaneously appeasing the dangerous criminals he owed money to. Instead, he would find himself staring into a financial abyss. We need to address his position within the company itself, I stated, turning away from the window. Freezing the accounts stops the theft, but he still holds the title of Chief Executive Officer. He still has the authority to sign contracts and liquidate physical assets like our cargo ships if he becomes desperate enough. Mr. Bradley nodded in agreement. We will strip him of his title tomorrow, but you cannot return to your estate tonight. Jared and Rachel will undoubtedly send the medical transport team to your house at dawn just as they planned. If you are there, they will attempt to force you into an ambulance before we can present this video evidence to a judge. You need to remain entirely off the grid until we bring the hammer down. Mr. Bradley handed me a magnetic key card to a secure, unlisted corporate suite owned by his law firm. It was paid for entirely in untraceable cash, completely disconnected from my name or any Jenkins worldwide shipping accounts. I took the key card and picked up my leather duffel bag. I spent the remainder of the night in that silent, sterile hotel room. I watched the city lights blink against the dark horizon. I mourned the son I thought I had raised and the family I thought I possessed. But grief is a luxury you can only afford after the war is won. The sun slowly began to rise over the sprawling skyline. It was Monday morning. The silent correction was about to make a deafening noise. The sun broke over the city skyline on Monday morning, casting long shadows across the financial district. I was not there to see Jared strut into the towering glass lobby of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping, but Willis had ensured I had a secure remote view of the executive floor. Jared walked into his corner office with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had successfully conquered his own father. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase on the mahogany desk, smoothed his tailored suit, and sat down in the high-backed leather chair that still technically belonged to me. He expected this morning to be a simple, victorious lap. He expected to confirm his $4 million wire transfer pay off his offshore creditors and receive a phone call confirming I had been successfully strapped to a gurney and locked inside a secure memory care facility. He reached for his computer mouse and woke up his dual monitors. He clicked on the encrypted banking portal. The screen froze. The little loading circle spun endlessly in the center of the display. Jared tapped his fingers impatiently against the desk, completely unaware that the slight delay was not a network error. It was the digital manifestation of a federal freeze clamping down on his entire existence. He picked up his desk phone to call corporate technology, barking a sharp command at his assistant to get someone up there immediately. He did not know that Willis had already instructed the tech department to ignore all calls from the corner office. Jared was entirely isolated in his glass tower, completely disconnected from the financial veins of the company he was actively trying to bleed dry. While Jared was aggressively clicking his frozen mouse, I was sitting 5 miles away in a secure, soundproof conference room located deep inside the offices of Bradley and Associates. Mr. Bradley sat to my right, organizing a stack of thick black binders. Across the polished wooden table sat the 3 most influential and fiercely loyal members of my board of directors. These were men and women I had known for decades. We had weathered economic crashes, dock strikes, and vicious industry competitors together. They had watched Jared grow up, and they had reluctantly supported his transition to chief executive officer only because I had personally vouched for him. When I walked into the room, their faces registered profound shock. They had received Jared's fraudulent email over the weekend, detailing my sudden tragic mental collapse and my urgent relocation to a medical facility. Seeing me stand before them in a crisp charcoal suit, my eyes sharp and my posture unyielding, immediately shattered the lie my son had carefully constructed. I did not waste time with pleasantries or dramatic explanations. I instructed Mr. Bradley to distribute the black binders. I opened my own copy and directed their attention to the original founding charter of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping, specifically Article 7, Section 4. I watched their eyes scan the heavy legal text. When I handed Jared the title of CEO 5 years ago, I never actually transferred the controlling shares. I had placed the entire empire into a revocable living trust, and I had embedded a golden share clause into the corporate bylaws. I retained the absolute unilateral power to dissolve his executive position with a single signature in the event of gross malfeasance. I directed the board members to turn to the second tab in their binders. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as they reviewed the unredacted financial ledgers Willis had pulled directly from Jared's secure drive. They stared at the undeniable proof of massive systematic embezzlement. They traced the flow of $12 million from our operational reserves directly into a shadow account in the Cayman Islands. They saw the forged expense reports, the unauthorized leverage of our cargo ships, and the desperate bleeding deficit my son had created to satisfy his offshore syndicate debt. The horror on their faces quickly morphed into a cold, hardened fury. They realized Jared had not only betrayed his father, but he had jeopardized the livelihoods of thousands of our employees. He was actively destroying a legacy that had fed their families for generations. One board member, a tough veteran of the shipping yards who had been with me since the very beginning, slammed his fist onto the table and demanded we call the authorities immediately. I raised my hand, silencing the room with a single gesture. I pulled a silver fountain pen from my inside jacket pocket. I turned to the final page of the binder, which contained the formal invocation of my golden share. I signed my name with a steady, forceful hand. The ink was barely dry before Mr. Bradley stamped the document with his official notary seal. Effective immediately, Jared Jenkins was officially stripped of his title, his salary, his corporate immunity, and his access to the building. He was no longer the CEO of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping. He was an unemployed criminal trespassing in my office. I looked at the three board members and issued a strict, non-negotiable command. They were to maintain absolute silence. No one was to leak a single word to the press, to the internal compliance officers, or to Jared's loyalists on the executive floor. I wanted Jared to continue believing he held all the cards. I needed him to walk blindly into his own destruction, completely unaware that the floorboards had already been removed from beneath his feet. The board agreed unanimously, sealing our strategy. We adjourned the meeting, and Mr. Bradley immediately dispatched the termination documents to the federal authorities to pair with the asset freeze. Back in the glass skyscraper, the illusion of Jared's power was rapidly evaporating. Willis sent me an audio intercept from the corner office. Jared was pacing furiously behind his mahogany desk, cursing at his frozen computer screen. His desk phone rang, shattering his frustrated silence. It was not his assistant or the IT department. The caller ID displayed an untraceable international number. Jared snatched the receiver, his voice tight with barely contained panic. The man on the other end of the line did not introduce himself. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying menace that echoed through the wire. The syndicate representative informed Jared that the highly anticipated $4 million wire transfer had been aggressively rejected by the Federal Banking Commission. The money had bounced. The offshore account was locked. Jared's final lifeline had been brutally severed. The man on the phone delivered a chilling ultimatum, giving Jared exactly 48 hours to produce the cash before they came to collect it in blood. The war was no longer just about corporate control. Jared was now fighting for his actual life. Through the high-definition lens of the concealed security camera, I watched my son transition from arrogance to absolute unfiltered terror. The phone call from his offshore syndicate had completely broken him. Jared slammed the receiver down and immediately began pacing the length of the executive office, his hands pulling at his hair. He was a desperate animal trapped in a cage of his own making, and the walls were rapidly closing in. He had 48 hours to produce millions of dollars in untraceable cash. His only remaining option was to cannibalize the company itself. He picked up his cell phone and dialed a number he had clearly kept on standby for an emergency exactly like this. He called a notorious private equity firm known entirely for executing aggressive hostile takeovers and stripping vulnerable companies down to their copper wiring. I listened through the encrypted audio feed as Jared practically begged the managing partners for a same-day meeting. He offered them the absolute crown jewel of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping. He offered to use our proprietary patented logistics routing software as direct collateral for an immediate high-interest cash loan. That software was the exact digital architecture I had spent 10 years developing from the ground up, the very system that made our shipping routes faster and more profitable than any global competitor on the market. It was a trade secret worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Jared was offering to hand it over to corporate scavengers for pennies on the dollar just to save his own skin and cover his massive syndicate debt. Less than 2 hours later, three men in sharp predatory gray suits walked into the corner office. These were the private equity sharks circling the blood in the water. Rachel had arrived just moments before them, summoned by Jared to help project an illusion of total control and absolute stability. She sat gracefully on the edge of the leather sofa, crossing her legs and offering the men a poised, rehearsed smile. She played the role of the supportive, powerful executive wife flawlessly. She poured them expensive, sparkling water and nodded knowingly as they opened their thick leather portfolios. She had absolutely no idea that her husband was secretly negotiating with his life on the line. She just thought they were executing another brilliant, ruthless business maneuver to expand their wealth. The lead executive, a sharp-featured man with slicked back hair, slid a massive stack of legal contracts across the mahogany desk. He looked at the paperwork with obvious greed. Getting their hands on my proprietary software would guarantee his firm an unprecedented return on investment. Jared leaned over the desk, his hands trembling slightly as he uncapped his expensive fountain pen. He tried to project confidence, spouting corporate buzzwords about liquidity and restructuring, but his voice carried the high, tight pitch of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. I sat in Mr. Bradley's secure conference room watching the monitors with cold, unwavering focus. My son was seconds away from signing over my life's work. He genuinely believed this dirty loan would be his ultimate salvation. Before Jared could press the nib of his pen to the signature line, the lead executive raised his hand, halting the process. The shark was greedy, but he was not stupid. He required a standard mandatory verification of corporate liquidity before transferring millions of dollars into Jared's accounts. He pulled out his phone and placed it squarely in the center of the desk on speakerphone. He dialed the direct line to the primary commercial bank that handled all of our corporate escrow accounts. Jared swallowed hard, a heavy bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. Rachel maintained her frozen, pleasant smile, completely oblivious to the trap they were currently standing inside. The bank representative answered on the second ring, reciting his professional automated greeting. The executive confidently requested immediate verbal confirmation that Jared Jenkins maintained the operational authority to leverage corporate intellectual property for a short-term capital loan. I watched the live feed as the room fell into a heavy, agonizing silence, while the representative checked the internal banking system. The voice that came back through the speakerphone was crisp, loud, and utterly devastating. "I am sorry, sir, but Jared Jenkins holds absolutely no signing authority for this corporation." The executive frowned, looking at Jared with sudden, sharp suspicion. He asked the representative to check again, stating that Jared was the chief executive officer. The representative did not hesitate. As of this morning, Jared Jenkins has been legally removed from his position by the primary shareholder. Furthermore, all accounts associated with his credentials are currently frozen under a federal fraud investigation. The atmosphere in this corner office shifted instantly from polite corporate negotiation to explosive, dangerous hostility. The lead executive snatched his phone off the table and ended the call. He stared at Jared with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Jared opened his mouth, stammering out desperate, incoherent excuses about a banking error and an internal administrative misunderstanding. The private equity sharks were not listening. They recognized a sinking ship the exact second they saw one. "You brought us in here to sell us stolen assets," the executive snarled aggressively, sweeping his legal contracts back into his briefcase. "You tried to collateralize intellectual property that you do not even legally own. You are running a massive fraud operation, and you tried to make us an unwitting party to a federal crime." Rachel dropped her poised facade, instantly standing up from the sofa with her eyes wide in absolute shock. She looked at her husband, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of the situation he had placed them in. The executives marched toward the glass doors, refusing to hear another word. The lead shark turned back one final time, pointing a sharp finger directly at Jared's chest. "Do not ever contact our firm again. My legal team will be notifying the authorities about this attempted wire fraud by the end of the business day." They walked out, slamming the heavy doors behind them. Jared collapsed back into his leather chair, burying his face in his shaking hands. He was officially stripped of his title, locked out of his money, and rejected by his very last financial lifeline. The syndicate clock was ticking loudly, and my son was entirely out of options. Jared watched the private equity executive storm out of his office, taking his absolute last shred of hope with them. Through the hidden camera feed, I observed my son physically collapse over his mahogany desk. He gripped his hair, pulling at the roots as the sheer reality of his impending doom washed over him. The offshore syndicate had given him exactly 48 hours to produce $15 million, and his primary strategy had just detonated in his face. He had no liquid cash, no operational authority, and no allies left in the corporate world. But desperation breeds a very specific type of reckless ingenuity. Jared suddenly sat up, his dark eyes wide and frantic. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and grabbed his desk phone. If he could not sell my patented logistics software, he would sell the physical steel that moved it. He decided to liquidate the company's international shipping fleet. Jenkins Worldwide Shipping owned 30 massive cargo freighters currently docked at various ports along the eastern seaboard. Jared planned to contact our industrial competitors and offer them immediate unconditional transfer of ownership for pennies on the dollar. He was willing to dismantle an $80 million physical infrastructure just to scrape together the quick cash required to save his own life. He frantically dialed the direct line to the primary port authority intending to authorize the immediate release of the fleet's maritime titles. This was a move of pure financial suicide. It would bankrupt the company entirely, leaving thousands of loyal employees without jobs, but Jared no longer cared about the legacy of the business. He only cared about surviving the week. He shouted into the receiver the second the harbor master answered the line. Jared bypassed all standard corporate protocols, aggressively ordering the port authority to unseal the registration deeds for our 5 largest Atlantic freighters. He claimed it was an emergency executive restructuring maneuver and demanded the titles be transferred to a blind holding company by noon. The harbor master asked Jared to confirm the action using his secure digital executive credentials. Jared impatiently opened his laptop, aggressively clicking through the authentication portal he had used hundreds of times before. He typed his master password and hit enter. A massive black warning box instantly hijacked his entire monitor. System lockdown. Credentials revoked. Protocol Omega initiated. Jared slammed his fist against the keyboard, screaming at the harbor master to manually override the system. The harbor master remained entirely professional but completely unyielding. He informed my son that the central corporate server had just broadcasted a global security mandate actively erasing Jared's administrative identity across all maritime databases. The harbor master promptly ended the call, refusing to engage with an unauthorized individual. Jared threw his phone across the room. It shattered against the glass wall. He did not know that Willis, my remarkably brilliant and deeply loyal head of information technology, had just pressed a single button on his terminal 5 floors below. Willis had activated the poison pill protocol. I had designed this specific digital failsafe a decade ago to protect the company from aggressive external cyber attacks. Willis simply redirected the architecture inward, using the protocol to completely obliterate Jared's digital footprint. Every password, every access card, and every signature authorization associated with my son was instantly turned to ash. Blinded by absolute rage, Jared stormed out of the executive suite. He completely ignored his panicked assistant and marched directly toward the private elevator. Finding his keycard useless, he violently kicked the call button panel before turning and taking the emergency stairs down to the secure server floor. Through the internal surveillance network, I watched him burst through the heavy fire doors, his face flushed and his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He marched straight into the glass-enclosed technology hub, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know who had locked him out of the Port Authority network. Willis was sitting calmly at his central monitoring station, sipping from a ceramic coffee mug. He did not flinch when Jared slammed his hands onto the workstation console. Jared explicitly ordered Willis to pack his desk and leave the building, screaming that he was officially terminated for corporate insubordination. Willis slowly set his coffee mug down. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue or attempt to defend his actions. He simply opened his top desk drawer, pulled out a single sheet of freshly printed paper, and slid it across the console toward Jared. It was an internal human resources memo legally stamped and verified by Mr. Bradley just an hour prior. Jared snatched the paper, his eyes darting frantically across the text. The memo officially confirmed that Jared Jenkins had been permanently stripped of all executive titles by the primary shareholder. It explicitly stated that he held absolutely zero legal authority to hire, fire, or command any employee within the building. Jared stared at the document, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. Willis looked up at him with cold, unwavering satisfaction and quietly suggested that Jared leave the server room before he called building security. The crushing weight of the situation finally broke through Jared's arrogant delusions. The memo explicitly referenced the primary shareholder taking direct action. I was the only primary shareholder. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. If I was actively issuing legal directives and coordinating complex digital lockdowns with the IT department, I was obviously not strapped to a bed in a heavily sedated stupor. His entire strategy relied on my total incapacitation. Jared stumbled backward away from Willis's desk, his breathing shallow and rapid. He practically sprinted out of the server room, pulling a burner phone from his pocket. He dialed Rachel's number in an absolute frenzy, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. Rachel answered on the first ring, her voice tight and laced with mounting panic. Jared frantically demanded to know if the medical transport team had successfully secured me at the estate. The response he received was a devastating blow to his crumbling reality. Rachel revealed that she was currently standing in my driveway alongside the two burly asylum orderlies Dr. Mercer had dispatched. They had bypassed the locks and stormed into the house at dawn, fully expecting to drag a confused, helpless old man out of his bed. Instead, they found an entirely empty house. Rachel screamed into the phone, her composure entirely shattered. She told Jared that my closets were cleared of all vital documents and the safe was hanging wide open. Pinned directly to the center of the living room wall was a massive, legally notarized cease and desist order threatening immediate federal kidnapping charges against Dr. Mercer and his facility. The medical team had taken one look at the legal document, panicked, and abandoned the job completely. I was completely off the grid, fully lucid, and dismantling their lives piece by piece. 12 hours earlier, while Jared was still sleeping soundly under the delusion of his impending victory, a sleek white medical transport van idled at the edge of my property. The sun had not yet broken over the horizon, casting my suburban estate in a cold, gray, pre-dawn light. I watched the live security feed from the safety of Mr. Bradley's corporate suite. The van bore no standard hospital markings, only a discreet logo for a private behavioral health contractor. The side doors slid open with a heavy mechanical clatter. Two massive orderlies stepped onto my gravel driveway. They did not look like registered nurses or compassionate healthcare providers. They possessed the thick, muscular builds of men hired specifically for their capacity to inflict brute force. One of them casually adjusted a heavy canvas straitjacket over his forearm, the thick leather straps dangling dangerously in the morning air. They were walking toward my front porch to effectively kidnap a 70-year-old man from his own home. Rachel pulled her luxury SUV up right behind them, stepping out into the chilly morning air with a look of eager anticipation. She had arrived to oversee the extraction personally, wanting to ensure her father-in-law was dragged out of his home without drawing the attention of the neighbors. She led the two burly men up the brick steps, fishing her master key out of her designer handbag. She expected a struggle. She expected an erratic, terrified old man barricaded in his bedroom, throwing things at the door. She inserted the key into the deadbolt, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a meticulously engineered psychological trap. The heavy oak door swung open before Rachel even had the chance to turn her key. I had intentionally left the front door completely unlocked. It was a calculated statement, a silent broadcast that I was not hiding, and I was certainly not afraid. Rachel hesitated on the threshold, her confident smirk faltering slightly as the two massive orderlies pushed past her into the grand foyer. The house was entirely silent. They fanned out their heavy boots, thudding against the hardwood floors as they swept through the first floor, searching for their target. They marched into the main living room, fully expecting to corner me in my armchair. Instead, they found a room that had been surgically stripped of its lifeblood. The heavy steel door of my hidden wall safe hung wide open, completely emptied of all stock certificates, offshore bonds, and crucial identification documents. Rachel sprinted into the room, her eyes darting frantically across the empty shelves and the cleared desk. The sheer reality of my disappearance began to crack her arrogant facade. Then she saw the centerpiece of my trap. Pinned directly to the center of the custom mahogany wall unit, dead center where my prized landscape painting usually hung, was a massive 3-page legal document. It was not a simple typed letter. It was a formally drafted, heavily notarized cease and desist injunction printed on thick legal stock. The red and gold seal of Mr. Bradley's high-powered law firm gleamed under the recessed lighting. Rachel slowly approached the wall, her breathing turning shallow as she read the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. The two orderlies stopped their search and stepped up behind her, reading the text over her shoulder. The legal injunction was aggressively specific and utterly terrifying for anyone attempting to execute an illegal medical extraction. It explicitly named Dr. Wyatt Mercer the exact behavioral health facility that employed the orderlies and Rachel herself. The document clearly stated that the primary resident of the estate was not missing, was not incapacitated, and was operating under the full protection of top-tier corporate legal counsel. It promised immediate devastating federal lawsuits for kidnapping, racketeering, and unlawful medical imprisonment against any individual who attempted to restrict my physical movement. It specifically threatened to personally sue the orderlies for participating in a criminal conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I watched through the hidden camera as the color completely drained from the faces of the two hired thugs. They were paid a premium to muscle a confused senior citizen into the back of a van, but they were absolutely not paid enough to face federal kidnapping indictments from a billionaire's legal team. The lead orderly took a massive step back, dropping the heavy canvas straitjacket directly onto my Persian rug. He looked at Rachel with pure, unfiltered disgust. He informed her that they were abandoning the pickup order instantly and advised her to never contact their facility again. Rachel screamed at them, demanding they search the upstairs bedrooms and fulfill their lucrative contract. The orderlies completely ignored her frantic commands. They turned their backs, marched straight out the front door, and practically sprinted back to their unmarked van. The tires screeched against the asphalt as they sped away, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and my legal wrath. Rachel was left standing entirely alone in the center of my living room. She stared at the empty wall safe and the terrifying legal document, fully realizing that their grand conspiracy had just been incinerated. Back in the present moment, the reality of that empty house was crashing down on Jared. He stood in the sterile hallway outside the corporate server room, pressing his burner phone hard against his ear. Rachel was screaming hysterically through the receiver, detailing the abandoned straitjacket and the terrifying legal threats pinned to my wall. Jared's chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths as he finally processed the catastrophic failure of his entire strategy. If I was completely free and legally shielded, their fabricated conservatorship plan was entirely dead. The fake Alzheimer's diagnosis was useless if they could not physically lock me inside a padded room and force me into a drugged stupor. I was out in the world in full command of my faculties and actively dismantling his financial access piece by piece. The offshore syndicate's 48-hour death clock was ticking loudly in his mind, and his primary shield had just evaporated. Jared slammed his fist against the concrete wall of the stairwell. He needed to locate me immediately before Mr. Bradley could file the criminal embezzlement charges with the district attorney. Jared realized that if he could not hire private thugs to quietly kidnap me, he would have to manipulate the authorities into doing his dirty work for him. His mind raced, calculating a new, highly dangerous pivot. He told Rachel to stop crying and to get her story perfectly straight. He decided to weaponize the local police department. He planned to march directly into the nearest precinct and file an emergency silver alert, claiming his severely demented, vulnerable father had wandered off the estate and was a profound danger to himself and the public. He hoped the police would hunt me down, drag me to a hospital under a mandatory psychiatric hold, and give Dr. Mercer one final window to seize control of my life. Jared was a cornered animal, and cornered animals rely on raw, reckless instinct. Standing in the sterile hallway outside the corporate server room, he realized that private muscle had completely failed him. If he could not hire untraceable thugs to drag me out of my home in the dark, he would have to manipulate the public authorities into executing his dirty work in broad daylight. Jared bolted from the corporate skyscraper and drove his luxury vehicle directly to the local police precinct. He burst through the double glass doors, aggressively adopting the persona of a thoroughly terrified, desperately concerned son. He approached the desk sergeant with his hands visibly shaking, breathing heavily as he reported a catastrophic family emergency. He claimed that his 70-year-old father, a man suffering from severe and rapidly advancing Alzheimer's disease, had violently wandered off his estate and vanished into the city. He formally filed a fraudulent silver alert, utilizing the full weight of the local law enforcement apparatus to initiate a massive manhunt. Jared provided the desk sergeant with a highly detailed, completely fabricated medical history drafted by Dr. Mercer. He handed over my exact physical description, a recent photograph from Haley's wedding where I looked intentionally exhausted, and the license plate number of my vintage sedan. He stressed to the officers with fabricated tears in his eyes that I was a profound immediate danger to myself and to the general public. He explicitly requested that if the patrol units located my vehicle, they should under no circumstances allow me to leave their sight. He painted a picture of a man who would likely become hostile, confused, and utterly detached from reality when confronted by uniforms. The local police department took the bait hook, line, and sinker. Within 15 minutes, the desk sergeant had officially broadcast my name, face, and vehicle description across all regional dispatch channels. Highway patrol units, city cruisers, and state troopers were all instantly mobilized to track down a wandering, endangered billionaire. Jared walked out of the precinct, climbed into the leather seat of his car, and let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. He firmly believed he had just engineered the ultimate foolproof checkmate. He knew that when the police inevitably pulled my car over, any protest or anger I displayed would simply be interpreted as the tragic symptoms of my supposed dementia. Jared was banking entirely on the standard operational procedures of law enforcement. He knew the police would not simply let a mentally incapacitated senior citizen drive away. His strategy was brutally simple. He wanted the police officers to forcibly extract me from my vehicle, place me in the back of a squad car, and transport me directly to the nearest state hospital on an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. The exact second I was securely locked inside the state medical system, Dr. Mercer would step back into the picture. Armed with his forged commitment papers and his medical credentials, the corrupt physician would legally assert himself as my primary care provider. He would authorize a heavy regimen of chemical sedatives, effectively drugging me into a silent, drooling stupor before transferring me directly to the locked memory care ward. Jared was actively using the badges and guns of honest police officers to execute the kidnapping that his hired orderlies had abandoned. It was a vile, brilliantly desperate move. It was also a move I had completely anticipated. You do not survive 35 years building a global shipping empire without learning exactly how a cornered, desperate opponent thinks. I was sitting comfortably in Mr. Bradley's secure, untraceable hotel suite when Willis sent a high-priority alert to my encrypted phone. My loyal IT director had been actively monitoring the local emergency dispatch frequencies. He forwarded the audio file of the police scanner directly to my device. I listened to a crackling dispatcher voice broadcast my exact license plate number and a warning that the driver was suffering from severe cognitive decline. I smiled grimly, finishing the last sip of my black coffee. Jared had just committed another massive federal crime by filing a false police report and weaponizing emergency services. I looked at Mr. Bradley, who was already packing his heavy leather briefcase. We did not hide. We went entirely on the offensive. We left the secure hotel suite and drove straight into the heart of the city. We did not wait for a patrol cruiser to spot my vintage sedan and pull us over on the side of a busy highway. We drove directly to the exact same Central Police precinct where Jared had stood shedding his fake tears just an hour prior. I stepped out of the vehicle and buttoned my tailored charcoal suit. I adjusted my silk tie and checked my posture in the reflection of the glass doors. I did not look like a lost, confused dementia patient wandering the streets in yesterday's clothes. I looked exactly like the billionaire founder of a global logistics empire preparing to buy the entire building. Mr. Bradley walked shoulder to shoulder with me, projecting the cold, lethal aura of a top-tier corporate litigator ready to dismantle anyone who stepped in our path. We pushed the double doors open and marched straight into the bustling lobby. The desk sergeant looked up from his computer terminal, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he instantly recognized my face from the urgent silver alert flashing across his monitor. He immediately stood up, his hand hovering instinctively near the radio on his shoulder to call for backup, before he could utter a single word of protocol. I approached the thick bulletproof glass partition. I slid my state-issued identification card through the metal slot. "Good morning, Sergeant," I said, my voice projecting a deep, resonant authority that commanded instant respect. "I understand my son was here recently reporting me as a missing, mentally unstable individual. I am here to officially cancel that fraudulent alert." I slid a small encrypted flash drive through the slot right next to my ID card. I informed him that the drive contained high-definition surveillance footage of my daughter-in-law handing a $50,000 cash bribe to a corrupt physician to fabricate my medical records. Mr. Bradley stepped forward, effectively taking command of the legal narrative. He pulled a thick, pristine medical folder from his briefcase and slid it through the metal partition. He instructed the desk sergeant to read the first page. The document was a flawless, independent, and legally binding psychiatric evaluation conducted just 3 days ago by the chief medical officer of the state medical board. It certified that my cognitive function was absolutely perfect. The sergeant picked up the documents, his eyes darting between the irrefutable medical proof, the flash drive, and my sharp, entirely lucid demeanor. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The police department had not been mobilized to save a wandering senior citizen. They had been aggressively weaponized by a desperate criminal trying to orchestrate an illegal corporate coup. The sergeant picked up his radio, his expression hardening into pure law enforcement fury. The hunter had just officially become the hunted. The heavy mahogany doors of the family courthouse swung open the following morning. I walked down the center aisle with my back straight and my head held high. Mr. Bradley walked beside me holding a single slim briefcase. Jared and Rachel were already seated at the petitioner table near the front. They had spent the entire night believing their fraudulent silver alert had worked and that I was currently strapped to a gurney in a state hospital. When they saw me walk into the courtroom looking perfectly composed in my tailored suit, the color completely drained from their faces. Jared gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. He immediately leaned over and whispered frantically to his high-priced legal team. The judge banged her gavel, bringing the emergency conservatorship hearing to order. Jared realized he had to pivot his strategy instantly. He stood up and launched directly into an Oscar-worthy performance. He forced real tears to well up in his dark eyes. He addressed the judge with a trembling voice, painting a heartbreaking picture of my supposed tragic cognitive decline. He told the court that I was completely detached from reality and suffering from violent, unpredictable outbursts. He shamelessly used the silver alert he had filed yesterday as evidence of my inability to care for myself, claiming I had wandered the streets lost and confused. Rachel sat beside him, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. She played the exhausted, deeply concerned daughter-in-law flawlessly. She nodded along with every lie Jared spun, murmuring about how heartbreaking it was to watch a brilliant man lose his mind. They told the judge that my immediate involuntary commitment was a matter of life and death. The judge listened carefully, taking notes and observing my calm demeanor from the bench. Jared concluded his opening statement by claiming that seizing my estate and freezing my financial autonomy was the only way to protect my legacy from my own madness. He sat down, wiping a fake tear from his cheek, fully convinced he had successfully manipulated the court. The judge then called their star witness to the stand to provide the binding medical testimony required to lock me away forever. Dr. Wyatt Mercer approached the witness stand with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed his medical license made him entirely untouchable. He was wearing another bespoke Italian suit projecting the image of a highly successful, highly sought-after behavioral health specialist. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore under oath to tell the absolute truth. Jared's lawyers began the direct examination, feeding Dr. Mercer softball questions designed to validate his fraudulent diagnosis. Dr. Mercer spoke directly to the judge, utilizing complex medical terminology to sound as authoritative as possible. He confidently stated that he had conducted a thorough, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of my mental faculties just 24 hours prior. He lied effortlessly, claiming that I could not identify my surroundings, that I was actively hallucinating conversations with deceased relatives, and that my neurological degradation was both severe and irreversible. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the wooden railing of the stand, and delivered the exact damning conclusion Jared had paid him $50,000 to say. Dr. Mercer testified that I lacked all fundamental capacity for independent living. He stated on the public record that I posed a profound physical danger to myself and required immediate permanent placement in a locked, secure memory care facility. He specifically recommended a total suspension of my legal and financial rights, advising the judge to grant Jared full conservatorship over my $80 million trust. He spoke with such practiced, polished sincerity that anyone lacking the facts would have believed every single word. Jared watched his hired mercenary deliver the fatal blow with poorly concealed satisfaction. He glanced over his shoulder at me, offering a microscopic, victorious smirk. He truly thought the game was over. He thought the word of a licensed medical professional would instantly overrule the protests of an elderly man. The judge thanked Dr. Mercer for his expert medical assessment and turned her attention to the defense table. She asked Mr. Bradley if he wished to cross-examine the witness. Mr. Bradley stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not carry a notepad. He He did not carry a stack of medical files. He walked toward the center of the courtroom empty-handed, projecting a cold, lethal calm. Mr. Bradley stopped a few feet away from the witness stand and looked Dr. Mercer directly in the eyes. He did not immediately launch into a fierce interrogation. He did not ask the doctor to clarify his diagnosis or challenge his medical methods. Instead, Mr. Bradley asked Dr. Mercer to verbally confirm his identity and his professional integrity for the official court record. Dr. Mercer puffed out his chest and proudly rattled off his credentials, reiterating that his medical opinion was entirely objective and based solely on the clinical evidence he had personally gathered. Mr. Bradley nodded slowly, accepting the perjured testimony without a single objection. He then turned his back on the witness stand and addressed the judge directly. He requested permission to submit a single piece of digital evidence into the official court record. The judge granted the request. Mr. Bradley signaled to his paralegal sitting in the front row. The paralegal walked over to the court clerk's audio-visual terminal and handed over the small encrypted flash drive I had brought from my home. The clerk plugged the drive into the system and lowered the projector screen behind the judge's bench. Jared shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His high-priced lawyers exchanged confused glances, entirely unaware of what was about to happen. They had prepared for a bitter argument over medical definitions and patient rights. They had not prepared for raw, unassailable digital surveillance. The bailiff dimmed the overhead lights. The massive courtroom monitor flickered to life. The high-definition video filled the screen, broadcasting the pristine, perfectly angled view from the hidden camera mounted inside my hallway smoke detector. The entire courtroom watched as the digital versions of Jared, Rachel, and Dr. Mercer stepped out of my living room and into the corridor. The hidden microphone was highly sensitive, catching the rustle of their clothing and the sharp, distinct clarity of their hushed voices. Jared's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. He instantly recognized the hallway of my estate. The trap had just been sprung and there was absolutely nowhere for him to run. The crisp digital audio echoed through the silent, cavernous courtroom. Rachel's voice cut through the stillness like a knife. The judge watched intently as the video showed Rachel reaching into her designer handbag and pulling out a thick, unmarked white envelope. She handed it directly to Dr. Mercer on the massive screen. $50,000 in cash, exactly as we agreed, Rachel's recorded voice whispered loudly across the courtroom speakers. The judge will approve the emergency conservatorship petition tomorrow morning based entirely on your signature. Make sure the facility director understands he must lock him in the secure ward immediately. The real Rachel let out a choked, desperate gasp from the petitioner's table. She covered her mouth with both hands, her entire body shaking violently as she watched her own felony broadcasted to the world. Jared sat completely frozen. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His grandiose posture collapsed. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a live landmine. The video continued to play flawlessly. Dr. Mercer's recorded voice filled the room, sealing his own destruction. The commitment papers are ironclad, the digital doctor replied, sliding the heavy envelope into his leather briefcase. He will not be able to make a single phone call, sign a single check, or leave the premises without your explicit written permission. The asylum staff knows exactly what to do. The video ended and the screen faded to black. The bailiff brought the lights back up. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. It was the heavy, terrifying quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. Dr. Mercer sat in the witness stand, his face dripping with cold sweat, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he realized he had just committed perjury and confessed to accepting a massive bribe on the official court record. Mr. Bradley did not ask a single follow-up question. He simply looked at the judge, smiled grimly, and stated that the defense rested its case. Jared stared at the blank monitor, realizing his entire life was over. The deafening silence that followed the black screen shattered like a pane of glass. The gallery behind us erupted into absolute pandemonium. Reporters sitting in the back rows furiously tapped on their phone screens, broadcasting the explosive evidence directly to their local newsrooms. The judge slammed her wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block, demanding immediate order in her court. Her face was flushed with righteous fury. She had just been used as an unwitting pawn in a massive criminal conspiracy. I remained seated next to Mr. Bradley, watching the chaos unfold with cold precision. The trap had closed perfectly. There were no legal loopholes left for my son to exploit. Dr. Wyatt Mercer finally broke from his paralyzed state of shock. He looked around the room with wild, terrified eyes. He realized his lucrative medical career, his pristine reputation, and his personal freedom had all just evaporated in a matter of seconds. Panic completely overrode his logic. He abruptly pushed his chair back from the witness stand. He grabbed his sleek leather briefcase and literally bolted toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom. He did not make it very far. The judge shouted a sharp command. Two massive bailiffs stepped directly into the center aisle, physically blocking his only escape route. They placed their hands firmly on their utility belts, daring the corrupt physician to take another step. Dr. Mercer froze, his chest heaving, realizing he was entirely trapped in a cage of his own design. The judge pointed a shaking finger directly at the disgraced doctor. She did not bother to lower her voice. She announced on the official court record that she was issuing an immediate bench warrant for his arrest. She commanded the bailiffs to take Dr. Wyatt Mercer into physical custody right then and there. She cited blatant perjury conspiracy to commit fraud and felony elder abuse. The bailiffs grabbed his arms, forced them behind his back, and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp click of the metal echoing in the room was the sweetest sound I had heard all year. Dr. Mercer began to stammer desperate, incoherent apologies, but the bailiffs physically dragged him out through the side-holding door. Jared snapped his head toward his high-priced legal team. His eyes were wide with pure desperation. He expected them to object, to file a sudden motion to use their expensive Ivy League degrees to pull him out of the fire. Instead, the lead defense attorney calmly stood up. He did not look at my son. He smoothly packed his legal pads into his briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. He turned to the judge and stated in a flat, thoroughly professional tone that he and his entire firm were officially withdrawing as counsel for the petitioners. He cited the sudden and unexpected discovery of a severe criminal conflict of interest. He effectively declared that he would not risk his own law license to defend a client who had just committed federal perjury on tape. The legal team turned their backs on Jared and walked right out the main doors. It was the ultimate abandonment. Jared and Rachel were left sitting completely alone at the large wooden table. They had no doctor to validate their lies and no lawyers to shield them from the consequences. The judge turned her furious gaze directly onto my son and daughter-in-law. She did not hold back an ounce of her judicial wrath. She explicitly stated that the emergency conservatorship petition was officially denied with extreme prejudice. She declared that the medical evaluation they had submitted was an absolute fabrication and formally impounded the document as state evidence. She made it perfectly clear that my legal rights, my financial autonomy, and my personal freedom remained entirely intact and unconditionally protected under the law. The judge went even further. She announced loudly that the civil portion of this hearing was officially concluded, but the criminal consequences were just beginning. She stated on the record that she was immediately referring Jared and Rachel Jenkins directly to the district attorney's office for a full-scale criminal investigation. She recommended charges of wire fraud, attempted extortion, and gross elder exploitation. Rachel broke down into hysterical, ugly sobs. She gripped the edge of the table and tried to cry out that it was all Jared's idea, that he had forced her to hand over the cash. The judge banged her gavel one final time, completely silencing my daughter-in-law. The court was officially adjourned. Mr. Bradley closed his slim briefcase and gave me a firm, satisfied nod. The courtroom battlefield had been thoroughly conquered. I stood up slowly from my chair and buttoned my tailored charcoal suit. I walked toward the center aisle, stopping briefly right next to the petitioner table. Jared looked up at me. His face was a portrait of total devastation. He was trembling violently, waiting for me to scream at him or mock his monumental failure. I did none of those things. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer him a single word of fatherly disappointment. I simply looked at him with the cold, empty realization of his absolute defeat. I turned away and walked out of the heavy mahogany doors, leaving him to sit in the ashes of his own grand conspiracy. As I stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, I knew the dynamic of the war had fundamentally shifted. Jared realized in that silent courtroom that his legal troubles were actually the least of his problems. The local police and the district attorney were terrifying, but they operated within the strict confines of the law. The offshore syndicate he owed $12 million to did not follow any laws. The 48-hour deadline they had given him was almost up. He was no longer fighting a courtroom battle against a wealthy old man. He was fighting for his actual physical life against ruthless loan sharks who wanted their money back. He had no lawyers, no corporate access, and no liquid cash. Jared was about to walk into a nightmare that no courtroom judge could save him from. The drive back from the courthouse was a suffocating descent into sheer terror for my son and daughter-in-law. Through the tracking software Willis had embedded in Jared's company-issued phone, I monitored their erratic route directly to their sprawling suburban estate. Jared was driving recklessly, running red lights and swerving through traffic, his mind entirely consumed by the ticking clock of his offshore debt. He had walked into the courtroom expecting to seize an $80 million trust. He was driving home an unemployed, publicly disgraced criminal with a highly dangerous target painted squarely on his back. Rachel sat perfectly rigid in the passenger seat, her flawless makeup ruined by tears of panic and mounting fury. They pulled through the iron gates of their manicured property expecting to find the hollow sanctuary of their massive home. Instead, they found an immediate terrifying escalation of their nightmare. Two heavily armored black SUVs were parked aggressively across the pristine front lawn. The vehicles had deliberately crushed the expensive rose bushes and torn deep muddy trenches into the perfectly landscaped grass. Jared slammed on his brakes, putting his car in park before it had even fully stopped. He knew exactly who those vehicles belonged to. The legal system operates with slow bureaucratic precision, but the international criminal syndicate he had defrauded operates with brutal, immediate efficiency. Jared stared at the tinted windows of the SUVs, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He had nowhere to run. His corporate accounts were entirely frozen. His passports were flagged by the federal authorities, and his own father had just legally severed him from all financial protection. He forced himself to step out of the car, his legs trembling violently as he walked up the marble steps of his own home. The heavy mahogany front door was already unlocked. Jared and Rachel walked into the grand foyer of their mansion to find three large, sharply dressed men waiting for them in the sunken living room. These were not the polished corporate executives Jared was used to manipulating over expensive steak dinners. These were hardened collection agents for an offshore syndicate that moved hundreds of millions of dollars through unregulated shadow markets. The lead enforcer, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar cutting across his jawline, sat comfortably on Rachel's custom Italian leather sofa. He did not stand up when they entered. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply looked at my son with the cold, dead eyes of an apex predator assessing a wounded animal. He demanded the immediate transfer of the $15 million Jared owed their organization. Jared completely fell apart. The arrogant, untouchable CEO facade he had worn for the past 5 years instantly dissolved into pathetic, stammering cowardice. He held his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender, his voice cracking as he tried to explain the catastrophic failure in the courtroom. He frantically blamed me for everything. He told the syndicate enforcers that his father had orchestrated a massive legal trap utilizing a hidden golden share to freeze all the corporate routing numbers and lock down the primary trust funds. He swore he had the money secured just 24 hours ago, begging them to understand that the sudden federal lock was an administrative hurdle he could inevitably bypass with a little more time. The lead enforcer listened to Jared's frantic, sweat-drenched excuses with absolute stony silence. He did not care about family drama, courtroom surprises, or frozen corporate accounts. He only cared about the money. The enforcer slowly stood up from the leather sofa, towering over my son. He walked across the expensive Persian rug and stopped mere inches from Jared's face. He spoke in a low, terrifyingly calm voice that echoed through the massive living room. He explicitly informed Jared that the syndicate did not grant extensions, did not accept corporate excuses, and absolutely did not care about his father's legal maneuvers. He delivered a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum. Jared had exactly 48 hours to deliver $15 million in untraceable liquid cash. If the money was not successfully routed into their offshore accounts by that exact deadline, the syndicate would return to collect their debt in blood. The enforcer made it perfectly clear that they would systematically dismantle Jared's entire life. They promised to take the sprawling mansion, the fleet of luxury cars parked in the garage, and every single asset hidden inside the property walls. But the threat did not stop at material possessions. The enforcer explicitly stated that once the assets were liquidated, Jared's life would be violently forfeit to cover the remaining interest. The reality of the situation crashed down on my son like a suffocating avalanche. He was completely out of moves. He could not sell my patented logistics software. He could not liquidate my shipping fleet. He could not hijack my medical authority to steal my personal fortune. He was staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun, and his vast web of lies had left him entirely without a shield. The 48-hour death clock was officially ticking, and the executioners were standing right inside his own living room. In that moment of sheer, unadulterated terror, Jared committed the ultimate act of cowardice. He looked desperately around the room for any available leverage to save his own skin. His panicked eyes landed on his wife, Rachel was standing near the entryway, shaking with fear, holding her designer handbag tightly against her chest. Jared pointed a trembling finger directly at her. He frantically told the syndicate enforcers that Rachel came from a highly affluent, wealthy white family with massive generational real estate holdings. He shamelessly offered his own wife as a financial target, begging the enforcers to extort her parents to cover the massive debt he had personally accumulated. He threw the woman he had married completely under the bus, demonstrating that his loyalty extended to absolutely no one but himself. Rachel stared at her husband with a look of pure, absolute disgust. The illusion of their powerful elite marriage shattered completely into a million jagged pieces on the hardwood floor. She realized in that exact second that she had tied her life to a weak, treacherous traitor who would gladly trade her safety to save his own neck. The enforcer simply smirked at Jared's pathetic display of betrayal. He reminded Jared that the debt belonged to him, not his in-laws, and tapped his watch to signal the start of the 48-hour countdown. The three men walked out of the mansion, climbing back into their black SUVs and driving off the ruined lawn. The heavy front door clicked shut, leaving Jared and Rachel entirely alone in the suffocating silence of their impending doom. The conflict had dramatically shifted from a corporate battle to a desperate struggle for survival, and the toxic alliance between my son and my daughter-in-law had just been irreparably destroyed. The sound of the black armored vehicles crunching down the gravel driveway slowly faded into the distance. Jared stayed completely frozen in the center of his sunken living room, staring vacantly at the heavy front door. Rachel did not hesitate for a single second. She turned her back on her husband without uttering a word and sprinted up the grand, sweeping staircase. The illusion of their elite power couple status had been violently incinerated the exact moment Jared offered her up to a ruthless criminal syndicate as collateral. She stormed into their massive walk-in closet and yanked a large designer suitcase from the top shelf. She was not packing for a weekend getaway. She was packing for immediate international exile. She felt absolutely no guilt about abandoning him. He had signed his own death warrant the moment he pointed his trembling finger at her. She ruthlessly grabbed her most expensive jewelry, tossing velvet boxes and loose diamonds into the bottom of the suitcase. She threw in cashmere sweaters and silk blouses, her hands moving with frantic, terrified speed. She knew the syndicate enforcers would return in exactly 48 hours to claim their blood debt, and she had absolutely no intention of being anywhere near Jared when that happened. She planned to drain their joint personal checking and savings accounts, secure a first-class flight to a non-extradition country, and leave the man she married to face the deadly consequences of his own monumental stupidity alone. Her survival instinct had completely overridden any lingering shred of matrimonial loyalty. She zipped the heavy suitcase shut and dragged it across the plush bedroom carpet, dropping it near the doorway. Rachel hurried over to her vanity desk. She flipped open her sleek silver laptop and quickly navigated to their primary wealth management portal. They maintained a joint personal account that typically held over $2 million in liquid cash money Jared had systematically siphoned from his massive corporate salary over the years. She typed her password with trembling fingers, calculating how quickly she could wire the entire balance to a secure offshore shell account her father had set up for her years ago. She hit the enter key and waited for the familiar dashboard to load. She fully expected to see the comforting, comma-heavy numbers that fueled her elite lifestyle. The screen flashed white, then immediately locked into a rigid, unyielding display. Rachel blinked, leaning closer to the monitor. The $2 million balance she expected to see was completely gone. In its place, a massive, bold zero glared back at her. A harsh red legal notice occupied the entire center of the screen. The text explicitly stated that the account had been seized under an emergency federal injunction regarding the recovery of embezzled corporate assets. Rachel slammed her hand against the desk, letting out a sharp gasp of pure panic. She frantically grabbed her smartphone and opened her secondary banking applications. She checked her personal credit cards, her high-yield savings, and her emergency investment portfolios. Every single account displayed the exact same devastating zero balance and the exact same terrifying legal blockade. She was entirely locked out of the financial system. The reality of my legal counteroffensive was finally crushing her. 10 years ago, when Jared and Rachel were first married, they demanded a home that reflected their new elite status. I purchased this sprawling suburban mansion for them in full, paying $7 million in cash. I allowed them to decorate the grand halls and host their lavish parties, permitting them to project the image of self-made success to their wealthy social circle. but I never actually transferred the property deed into their names. I placed the entire estate along with all the luxury vehicles parked in the garage directly into my irrevocable founder's trust. They were essentially just highly privileged tenants living rent-free in a fortress I completely controlled. Jared had aggressively funded their extravagant lifestyle using money stolen directly from my operational reserves. Mr. Bradley and I had legally traced every single stolen dollar back to their joint personal accounts. Because the stolen funds were commingled with their legitimate savings, my legal team was able to execute a devastating maneuver. We filed an immediate civil asset forfeiture claim under the guise of corporate restitution. The Federal Banking Commission authorized the total seizure of their personal wealth to restitute the $12 million Jared had drained from the logistics empire. Rachel realized with sickening clarity that my financial reach extended far beyond the corporate skyscraper. I had surgically removed their entire safety net, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. Rachel grabbed her laptop and stormed back down the grand staircase, her face flushed with unhinged, violent rage. Jared was still standing in the exact same spot in the living room, staring blankly at the floor like a broken statue. Rachel hurled the expensive laptop directly at his chest. It crashed against his shoulder and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. She screamed at him, her voice echoing shrilly through the massive empty house. She called him a pathetic failure, a useless coward, and a catastrophic mistake. She viciously mocked his inability to outsmart a man he had previously dismissed as a senile walking corpse. She demanded to know how he could be stupid enough to let an old man completely dismantle their entire lives in less than 24 hours. Jared flinched, holding his hands up defensively, but he had absolutely no answers to give her. The toxic, parasitic marriage they had built entirely on ambition and greed shattered completely in that living room. Rachel realized that Jared was not the brilliant, untouchable titan of industry she thought she had married. He was a weak, terrified imposter who had just sacrificed her safety to appease a gang of loan sharks. She spat at his feet, grabbed her heavy suitcase from the bottom of the stairs, and marched toward the front door. She turned back one last time and told Jared she hoped the syndicate tore him apart. The heavy front door slammed shut, the booming sound vibrating through the walls of the mansion. Jared was left standing entirely alone in a house he did not own, with zero money in his bank accounts, and less than 47 hours to produce $15 million to save his own life. The walls were rapidly closing in, and his nightmare was only just beginning. The toxic fallout inside the mansion was violently interrupted by the sound of a heavy car door slamming in the driveway. Through the integrated security system I had installed at the property a decade ago, I watched the live feed of the grand foyer. The massive front doors swung open to reveal my granddaughter, Haley. She was supposed to be boarding a first-class flight to her honeymoon in the Maldives. Instead, she stood in the entryway of her parents' home, still wearing her white rehearsal dress from the morning after the wedding. Her face was completely drained of color. She held her smartphone in her trembling hand with the screen illuminated. Local news outlets had just broken the story of the explosive courtroom scandal. Financial blogs were rapidly reporting the catastrophic federal freeze on Jenkins' worldwide shipping accounts and the stunning removal of her father as chief executive officer. Haley walked slowly into the sunken living room where the wreckage of her parents' marriage was currently on full display. Rachel's heavy designer suitcase still sat abandoned near the staircase. Jared remained slumped on the custom Italian leather sofa, looking like a completely hollowed-out shell of a man. The sheer panic radiating from him was palpable even through the digital surveillance feed. Haley did not offer them a warm greeting. She did not ask if they were okay. She held up her phone, displaying a prominent news headline about the sudden criminal investigation into the corporate leadership. She demanded to know exactly what was happening and why her grandfather had been at the center of a judicial emergency hearing instead of sitting at her reception. Jared immediately snapped into his deeply ingrained reflex of aggressive manipulation. He stood up from the sofa, holding his hands out in a desperate, placating gesture. He tried to spin a frantic, convoluted lie about a massive administrative banking error and a hostile corporate misunderstanding. He swore to his daughter that I was suffering from a severe, tragic mental breakdown, and that the courtroom spectacle was simply a horrible symptom of my advancing dementia. He promised Haley that his legal team was actively handling the crisis, and that her perfect new life would be entirely unaffected. He was actively trying to gaslight his own child while staring down the barrel of a $15 million syndicate debt. It was a pathetic, nauseating display of absolute cowardice. Before Jared could weave another pathetic excuse, Rachel maliciously tore his entire fabricated narrative to shreds. Standing near the base of the sweeping staircase with her escape plan entirely ruined, she looked at her husband with pure, unadulterated venom. She possessed absolutely no reason to protect him anymore. Rachel turned to Haley and delivered the fatal blow with the cold precision of an executioner. She told her daughter to stop listening to the lies of a failed, bankrupt criminal. Rachel explicitly revealed that there was no banking error and no tragic dementia diagnosis. She confessed right there in the grand foyer that Jared had systematically embezzled millions of dollars from the logistics empire to pay off violent loan sharks. She then delivered the ultimate, devastating truth. She looked Haley dead in the eye and stated that every single cent of her extravagant $500,000 wedding had been paid for with money Jared had actively stolen directly from my operational reserves. The horrifying magnitude of the betrayal crashed down on Haley like a physical weight. I watched through the camera feed as she physically stumbled backward away from her parents. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid as the puzzle pieces violently locked into place. The lavish ice sculptures, the imported silk drapery, the towering champagne fountains, and the 400 elite guests were not a celebration of her future. They were a grotesque, multi-million-dollar smokescreen designed specifically to mask a corporate robbery. The devastating realization hit her instantly. She finally understood exactly why I had been aggressively turned away at the ballroom doors by rented security guards. I was not a confused old man ruining her photographs. I was the target of a massive criminal conspiracy, and her perfect wedding was the exact weapon they used to execute it. Haley did not cry. She did not collapse into a chair and demand comforting lies. She possessed the exact same fierce, unyielding moral backbone that her grandmother Evelyn had carried her entire life. Haley looked at the two people who raised her with an expression of absolute, profound disgust. She publicly denounced them right there in the center of the extravagant foyer they did not even legally own. She told Jared that he was a disgrace to the family name and a coward who had weaponized his own child to steal from the man who gave him everything. She told Rachel that her complicit silence made her just as vile as the thief she married. Haley officially severed all ties with her parents, declaring that she would never allow their toxic corruption to infect her new marriage. She turned her back on them and walked out the front door, leaving them entirely alone in the suffocating ruins of their impending doom. 20 minutes later, the quiet sanctuary of my own home was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling rapidly into my driveway. I walked to the front door and opened it before she even had the chance to ring the bell. Haley stood on my porch, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting paths down her pale cheeks. She fell into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably against my shoulder. We stood there in the quiet entryway of my estate, holding each other as the remnants of the storm raged miles away. She begged for my absolute forgiveness, apologizing repeatedly for believing the lies they had fed her about my mental health. She told me she was deeply ashamed that her wedding had been used as the stage for my public humiliation and my attempted destruction. I gently pulled back and looked my beautiful granddaughter directly in the eyes. I told her that she carried absolutely zero blame for the actions of a desperate, cowardly thief. I wiped the tears from her face and guided her into the living room. I walked over to the mantel and picked up the small velvet box I had carried to the ballroom doors. I opened the clasp, revealing the flawless diamond necklace resting inside. I told her that I had promised Evelyn she would wear this on the first day of her new life. I fastened the cold silver clasp around her neck. In that quiet moment, the true legacy of my family was permanently secured. The toxic branch of the family tree had been entirely amputated, but the roots remained strong. The conflict had dramatically shifted again. Jared and Rachel were now completely isolated, with the syndicate deadline rapidly approaching, while I was busy preparing the final crushing blow to permanently reclaim my corporate throne. Tuesday morning brought a crisp, pale sunlight that reflected off the towering glass facade of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping. I stepped out of the back of my town car and looked up at the skyscraper I had built from absolutely nothing. For the past week, I had operated entirely from the shadows, dismantling my son's conspiracy from untraceable hotel rooms and secure law offices. Now it was time to step back into the light and reclaim my physical throne. I smoothed the lapels of my dark navy suit and walked through the revolving glass doors into the expansive marble lobby. The morning rush of executives, logistics coordinators, and administrative staff was in full swing. The moment my shoes clicked against the marble, the bustling noise of the lobby completely died. The employees stopped in their tracks. The sea of hundreds of professionals physically parted before me, creating a wide, clear path directly to the executive elevators. They had all seen the devastating local news reports broadcasting the courtroom scandal and the federal asset freeze. They knew exactly who had orchestrated the lockdown. I walked through the parted crowd with my head held high, acknowledging my loyal staff with subtle, reassuring nods. Waiting for me at the base of the private elevator bank was Willis. My brilliant head of corporate technology wore a sharp suit instead of his usual casual attire, matching the gravity of the moment. He held a secure, glowing tablet in his hands. He handed the device to me with a respectful nod, stating that the entire building was completely locked down and awaiting my final command. I looked down at the tablet Willis had handed me. The screen displayed the live security feed from the top floor corner office. Jared was completely trapped inside the glass walls of his former sanctuary. He had driven straight to the corporate headquarters after the devastating confrontation with Haley at his mansion, desperately hoping to use his remaining physical access to destroy evidence. He was entirely unaware that Willis had silently reactivated his building pass card at the exact break of dawn, specifically to lure him into a controlled environment where we could corner him. The surveillance feed showed my son operating in a state of pure unhinged panic, completely detached from his usual polished arrogance. His expensive suit jacket was thrown carelessly onto the floor. His tie was loosened, and his dress shirt was soaked with nervous sweat. He was frantically tearing through the heavy filing cabinets behind his mahogany desk. Jared was grabbing fistfuls of printed financial ledgers, offshore banking correspondences, and illegal contract drafts. He was aggressively shoving the thick stacks of paper into the heavy-duty industrial shredder in the corner of the room. The machine groaned and whined under the immense volume of paper, churning out bags of useless confetti. He genuinely believed that if he could physically destroy the hard copies of his embezzlement, he might somehow slow down the impending federal investigation. He was too blind to realize that Willis had already backed up every single digital keystroke and scanned document to a secure offshore server weeks ago. Jared was systematically destroying paper that no longer mattered, exhausting his final ounces of energy on a completely futile task. I handed the tablet back to Willis and stepped into the private elevator. The elevator doors slid open silently on the executive floor. 4 massive corporate security guards, the very same men Jared had repeatedly threatened to fire over the years, were already waiting for me in the hallway. They fell into formation directly behind my shoulders. We walked down the plush carpeted corridor toward the corner office. I did not bother to knock. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped into the room. The loud grinding noise of the industrial shredder masked our entry for a brief second. Jared was bent over a filing cabinet, his hands full of manila folders, completely oblivious to his audience. I stood in the center of the room, flanked by my security detail, and watched him frantically feed another stack of evidence into the machine. "Step away from the shredder, Jared," I commanded. I did not raise my voice to a scream. I did not inject a single ounce of anger into my tone. I spoke with the cold, absolute authority of a founder addressing a disgraced trespasser. Jared jumped, dropping the manila folders onto the floor. He spun around his chest, heaving his eyes, darting frantically between me and the 4 security guards, blocking his only exit. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the shredder, then at the scattered papers at his feet, and finally at my unyielding expression. The reality of his total defeat crashed down upon him. I instructed Willis, who had followed us into the room, to unplug the shredding machine and confiscate the remaining files for the federal authorities. I looked at the lead security guard and gave a single definitive nod. The 4 men immediately stepped forward and surrounded my son. Jared did not fight back. The fight had been entirely drained from his body. They instructed him to leave his personal cell phone, his corporate keys, and his laptop on the desk where they belonged. They flanked him closely, gripping his upper arms to ensure he did not attempt any sudden movements or aggressive retaliation. They marched him out of the executive suite, down the long carpeted corridor, and into the primary employee elevator. I followed closely behind them, ensuring that I personally oversaw his absolute physical removal from my business empire. We rode down the 20 flights in heavy, suffocating silence, the tension in the small space nearly suffocating. When the elevator doors finally opened on the ground floor, the entire dynamic of the building had shifted to witness his departure. The massive marble lobby was packed with hundreds of employees. Warehouse managers, logistics coordinators, and administrative assistants stood in complete silence. These were the hardworking men and women Jared had verbally abused, undervalued, and terrorized for the past 5 years. They watched with unwavering satisfaction as the disgraced, trembling former executive was physically paraded through the center of the room by armed guards. Jared kept his head bowed, his eyes glued to the polished marble floor. He could not bring himself to look at the people whose livelihoods he had nearly destroyed to pay off his offshore syndicate debts. The security team marched him directly through the revolving glass doors and pushed him out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. He stumbled slightly, catching his balance as the heavy doors locked behind him. His public humiliation was absolute, profound, and permanently final. Jared was forced to hail a standard city cab from the curb outside my corporate skyscraper. He had no company car, no executive driver, and no access to his frozen digital wallet. He sat in the back of the peeling vinyl seat, completely numb as the vehicle crawled through midday traffic toward his suburban estate. His mind was a frantic blur of terrifying calculations. The offshore syndicate had given him an absolute 48-hour deadline to produce $15 million, and the clock was ticking down with lethal speed. He desperately needed the quiet sanctuary of his massive home to gather his thoughts and formulate a completely new survival strategy. He paid the cab driver with the last few crumpled bills he found stuffed in his jacket pocket and stepped out onto the sidewalk at the edge of his property. The heavy iron gates of his estate were locked wide open. Jared walked up the long, sweeping gravel driveway and immediately froze in his tracks. The sprawling, perfectly manicured front lawn was heavily occupied by 3 massive commercial moving trucks. The loading ramps were extended and dozens of burly men in matching gray uniforms were marching in and out of the grand front doors. Jared watched in absolute horrifying disbelief as the moving crew carried his custom Italian leather sofa straight out of the living room and loaded it onto the truck. 2 other workers followed closely behind, carefully carrying the expensive modern art pieces Rachel had meticulously curated over the last decade. They were systematically gutting the interior of his magnificent $7 million fortress. The safe haven he had desperately rushed home to find was being actively dismantled piece by piece right in front of his eyes. Jared broke into a frantic sprint. His designer shoes slipped on the loose gravel as he charged up the wide brick steps toward the massive wraparound porch. He fully intended to scream at the moving crew and physically block the front door to protect his remaining possessions. But before he could even cross the threshold, a tall, familiar figure stepped out from the shadow of the tall white columns. Mr. Bradley stood perfectly centered on the porch, blocking the entrance. My ruthless corporate attorney was not wearing his usual courtroom suit. He wore a sharp, tailored overcoat and held a thick metal clipboard in his hand, projecting the cold, calculated authority of an executioner overseeing a final sentence. He looked down at my son with an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. Jared skidded to a halt, his chest heaving with exhausted, panicked breaths. He pointed a shaking finger at the moving trucks and aggressively demanded to know by what legal right my attorney was trespassing on his private property. Mr. Bradley did not flinch or raise his voice to match my son's hysterical screaming. He simply detached a thick, heavily stamped legal document from his metal clipboard and thrust it directly into Jared's chest. Jared was forced to grab the paper before it fell to the porch floor. Mr. Bradley explicitly informed him that he was holding a formal 30-day eviction notice, legally verified and brutally effective, immediately. He stated on the record that my son had fundamentally violated the basic terms of his occupancy the exact second he decided to funnel stolen corporate assets through the estate. Jared stared down at the eviction notice, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. He tried to muster a pathetic defense, stammering that he possessed marital property rights and establishing tenant protections under the state law. He insisted that I could not simply throw him and his wife out onto the street without a lengthy formal civil court process. Mr. Bradley completely shattered his arrogant assumption with a single, devastating sentence. He reminded Jared that 10 years ago when I purchased the sprawling estate, I never actually signed the property deed over to him or Rachel. I deliberately placed the massive home and every single luxury vehicle parked in the garage directly into my irrevocable founder's trust. They were never homeowners. They were merely highly privileged guests living entirely rent-free under my protective umbrella. Mr. Bradley smoothly delivered the final catastrophic blow. He explicitly explained that the entire mansion and all of its high-value contents were being aggressively liquidated by my legal team starting this exact second. Because Jared had actively commingled the $12 million he stole from the logistics empire with his personal checking accounts, every single item inside the house was now legally subject to emergency corporate asset forfeiture. The expensive art, the custom furniture, and the imported vehicles were all being seized to directly repay the staggering deficit he had created to appease his offshore syndicate. Mr. Bradley looked Jared dead in the eyes and informed him that the locks had already been changed. Jared and Rachel were officially stripped of their sanctuary. They were completely and legally homeless. The sheer magnitude of the absolute destruction finally broke whatever fragile thread of sanity Jared was clinging to. The impending threat of the violent offshore loan sharks, combined with the total loss of his wealth, his home, and his corporate identity, pushed him completely over the edge into pure mindless rage. Jared let out a guttural scream of absolute desperation. He dropped the legal documents onto the porch and lunged forward, attempting to physically assault Mr. Bradley. He swung a wild, reckless punch aimed directly at the attorney's jaw. Mr. Bradley did not even take a step back to defend himself. Before Jared's fist could connect, two of the massive uniform-clad movers stepped swiftly out from the foyer. They were not just movers, they were highly trained private security contractors embedded with the crew for this exact scenario. The lead security contractor smoothly intercepted Jared's arm, twisting it backward and forcefully shoving him away from my attorney. Jared stumbled backward, his expensive shoes catching on the edge of the brick stairs. He tumbled hard onto the crushed gravel driveway, scraping his hands and tearing the knees of his tailored suit pants. He hit the dirt and stayed there, gasping for air. He looked up at the towering white columns of the mansion he used to rule. The moving trucks continued to hum loudly, drowning out his ragged breathing. Jared finally realized the absolute terrifying truth of his existence. He was completely powerless. He possessed zero money in his frozen accounts. He had zero legal authority to his name. He had zero shelter to hide inside. And the ruthless offshore syndicate was actively hunting him down. The walls had completely closed in. The cold reality of Jared lying defeated on the gravel driveway of his seized estate was entirely eclipsed by the events of the following dawn. Before the violent offshore syndicate could even dispatch their collectors to hunt him down, a massive convoy of dark federal vehicles silently breached the perimeter of the affluent suburban neighborhood. It was barely 6 in the morning when armored tactical units and unmarked sedans aggressively surrounded the property line of the mansion. Jared and Rachel had spent the night sleeping on the floor of a cheap roadside motel, using the very last few crumpled bills from Jared's suit pocket. They returned to the estate boundary at daybreak, desperately hoping to beg the private moving crew for a few essential personal items or hidden cash. Instead, they found themselves staring directly into the headlights of a heavily coordinated federal raid. The district attorney had not wasted a single second of the night. Working hand in hand with the massive trove of financial evidence Mr. Bradley had meticulously compiled, the federal task force had constructed an absolutely watertight criminal case in record time. The encrypted corporate ledgers, the offshore banking routing numbers, the forged medical documents, and the high-definition bribery footage formed an inescapable, airtight legal net. The federal authorities possessed a flawless, irrefutable paper trail proving gross corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Jared had desperately tried to outrun his syndicate debt, completely blind to the fact that he was actually walking straight into the jaws of a federal penitentiary. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the thick morning fog, signaling the absolute end of his criminal reign. 2 federal agents immediately spotted Jared and Rachel standing near the edge of the wrought iron gates. They did not approach with cautious questions or polite inquiries. They marched forward with drawn weapons and strict barking commands, ordering my son and daughter-in-law to drop to their knees on the damp pavement. Rachel began to scream hysterically, her voice shrill and panicked. She aggressively pointed at her husband, loudly declaring her complete innocence and claiming she was a victim to anyone who would listen. The seasoned agents ignored her frantic protests entirely. They forced Jared's hands behind his back and clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, reading him his Miranda rights with brutal, practiced efficiency. Rachel received the exact same harsh treatment, her ruined designer clothes scraping against the dirty concrete as the cold metal locked her fate permanently to his. The sheer commotion of the massive federal raid had inevitably attracted the eager attention of the local media. News vans with towering satellite antennas swarmed the quiet suburban street, their camera crews fighting aggressively for the best angle of the spectacular downfall. The live morning broadcast beamed the humiliating arrest directly into the homes of millions of viewers across the state. The exact same elite socialites, wealthy corporate investors, and powerful city politicians who had attended Haley's extravagant wedding just a few days prior were now watching the architect of that lavish event being shoved roughly into the back of a federal transport vehicle. The elite circles of the city watched in absolute horror as the glamorous, untouchable facade of the Jenkins family was violently torn away on live television. Jared and Rachel were no longer high society royalty commanding respect in opulent ballrooms. They were publicly disgraced felons stripped of their stolen wealth, their stolen home, and their dignity paraded in front of the cameras for the entire world to witness. The devastating reach of the federal indictment did not stop at my son and daughter-in-law. The task force simultaneously executed a high-profile arrest warrant on the exact opposite side of the city. Dr. Wyatt Mercer was aggressively apprehended in the grand marble lobby of his pristine upscale private medical clinic. He was wearing another one of his bespoke Italian suits, preparing to greet his wealthy morning patients when federal agents flanked him and marched him out in heavy handcuffs. The high-definition footage of him accepting a $50,000 cash bribe in my hallway had been submitted directly to the state medical board before the sun even came up. His prestigious license to practice medicine was immediately and permanently revoked. The arrogant physician who had callously sworn under oath that I belonged in a locked memory care ward was now facing decades in a federal prison cell for gross perjury, severe medical malpractice, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The entire network of corruption Jared had so carefully woven together was brought to its knees in a single morning. The corrupt officials, the shady offshore financial facilitators, and the medical mercenaries were all systematically dismantled by the overwhelming weight of the evidence. Mr. Bradley had executed a flawless legal siege, ensuring that every single individual who had participated in the plot to erase my existence was held entirely accountable. The tactical precision of the massive federal sweep sent a terrifying, unmistakable message to the offshore syndicate as well. The loan sharks realized instantly that any attempt to collect their debt would mean stepping directly into the crosshairs of an active, highly aggressive federal investigation. They completely abandoned their pursuit of Jared, cutting their massive losses and leaving him to rot entirely in the hands of the justice system. I sat alone at the marble island in my quiet kitchen, holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. The large television mounted on the wall silently broadcasted the breaking news coverage. I watched the shaky helicopter camera footage of my only son being pushed into the back of an armored federal transport van. His head was bowed deeply, his face hidden from the flashing cameras, but I could clearly see the absolute crushing ruin in his posture. Any other man might have felt a surge of triumphant vindication watching his treacherous enemies fall so spectacularly. I felt absolutely no joy. There was no celebratory smile on my face, no grand sense of victorious relief swelling in my chest. I felt only the heavy, exhausting burden of a patriarch forced to execute an agonizing but entirely necessary correction. I had spent my entire life building an $80 million empire from the ground up, fighting through relentless adversity and societal barriers to secure a legacy of wealth, power, and stability for my family. To watch my own flesh and blood twist that hard-earned legacy into a weapon of pure greed was a profound, deeply personal tragedy. The operation was entirely necessary. Jared had become a malignant tumor threatening the very survival of the logistics company and the physical safety of the people I loved. I had to surgically excise the corruption before it completely destroyed everything I had built over the last 4 decades. I picked up the television remote and turned the screen off, letting the vibrant news broadcast fade instantly to black. The house was perfectly, beautifully silent. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the bitter warmth ground me in the present moment. The empire was officially secure. The immediate threat was entirely neutralized, and the long, difficult process of rebuilding could finally begin. The sterile silence of my kitchen was broken by the sharp ringing of my private cell phone. I had spent the last 2 hours watching the local news loop the footage of the federal raid, processing the monumental shift in my reality. I looked down at the illuminated screen resting on the marble island. The caller identification did not display a familiar contact name. It displayed the official routing number of the federal detention center downtown. I knew exactly who was utilizing their single legally mandated phone call. I picked up the device and pressed the green button, holding the speaker to my ear in absolute silence. The immediate sound that came through the receiver was not the smooth, arrogant baritone of a high-powered chief executive. It was the ragged, wet sobbing of a completely broken man stripped of all his manufactured armor. "Dad, please!" Jared choked out between heavy, hyperventilating gasps. The bravado he had wielded at the ballroom doors just a few days ago had entirely vanished, replaced by the terrified pleading of a cornered coward. He told me he was locked in a concrete holding cell waiting for his arraignment. He practically screamed into the receiver that the federal magistrate was planning to deny bail unless a massive cash bond was immediately posted. He begged me to contact Mr. Bradley and authorize a wire transfer to the court. He desperately promised that he would do anything I asked, sign any document, and surrender any future claim to the logistics company if I just bought his freedom. He was crying like a frightened child, expecting his father to magically wipe away the consequences of his catastrophic greed. I listened to him weep, feeling the cold, hard weight of 35 years of fatherhood pressing down on my chest. Jared realized his frantic apologies were meeting a wall of absolute silence, so he immediately pivoted to his most deeply ingrained defense mechanism. He began shifting the blame. He frantically insisted that the entire embezzlement scheme was actually Rachel's fault, claiming her insatiable demand for a luxury lifestyle had driven him into the arms of the offshore syndicate. He swore he never actually intended to hurt me, framing the forged medical documents and the hired asylum orderlies as a desperate temporary measure to protect the family legacy from his violent creditors. He was weaving a pathetic web of excuses, refusing to take a single ounce of accountability for plotting the systematic destruction of my life. When the finger-pointing failed to elicit a response from me, Jared resorted to the ultimate venomous emotional manipulation. He lowered his voice into a raw, cracking whisper designed to pierce a parent's heart. "I am your son. Dad." Jared cried, his voice echoing through the sterile federal phone line. "You are my father. You are supposed to protect me. You cannot just leave me in a concrete cage to rot for the rest of my life. You have to save me." He was actively weaponizing the very biological bond he had been perfectly willing to sever for $80 million. He genuinely believed that my unconditional love was a limitless resource he could exploit, even after attempting to bury me alive. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the bitter warmth of my black coffee settle in my stomach before I finally spoke. I did not yell at him. I did not hurl insults or match his hysterical pitch. I responded with the absolute freezing clarity of a man who had successfully excised a fatal tumor. A son does not pay a corrupt physician $50,000 in cash to lock his father inside a secure memory care facility, I stated firmly, my voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. A son does not steal $12 million from the hardworking employees who built his inheritance. You stood at the doors of your own daughter's wedding and publicly declared me insane while actively draining my life's work. You made your choices with your eyes wide open, Jared, I continued, cutting off his desperate attempts to interrupt me. You chose to climb into bed with an offshore criminal syndicate. You chose to forge my signature, steal my operational reserves, and attempt to strip away my basic human rights. I am not the architect of your downfall. I am simply the mirror reflecting the catastrophic reality of your own monumental greed. I will not post your bail. I will not send Mr. Bradley to negotiate a plea deal on your behalf. You built this cage entirely by yourself, and now you must learn how to survive the consequences of living inside it. Dad, no, please do not hang up, Jared screamed, his voice breaking into a terrified, high-pitched wail. I did not offer him a single closing sentiment. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, instantly cutting off the sound of his begging. I navigated to my phone's settings and permanently blocked the detention center's routing number, ensuring my son could never invade my peace again. I set the device face down on the marble counter. The heavy, emotional anchor I had carried for the past year completely dropped away. The doorbell chimed softly through the quiet house. I walked to the foyer and opened the door to find Mr. Bradley standing on the porch, holding a pristine leather portfolio. Mr. Bradley walked into my study and spread the final legal documents across my mahogany desk. They were not corporate injunctions or eviction notices. They were the highly fortified, irrevocable trust documents securing the entire future of my $80 million estate. I picked up my silver fountain pen and signed my name on the designated lines. I officially transferred the primary beneficiary status, completely bypassing my disgraced son and legally anchoring the Jenkins family legacy directly to my brilliant, fiercely moral granddaughter, Haley. Mr. Bradley stamped his notary seal onto the thick paper, making the transfer absolutely permanent. The toxic, parasitic branch of my family tree had been entirely and legally severed. The empire was permanently shielded from the greed that had nearly destroyed it. Exactly 1 year has passed since the morning the federal vehicles surrounded that sprawling suburban estate. The towering glass skyscraper of Jenkins Worldwide Shipping stands taller and stronger than it ever did during my son's disastrous tenure. The frantic bleeding of our corporate reserves is a distant memory completely erased by aggressive restructuring and flawless management. I did not reclaim the corner office for myself. I handed the title of Chief Executive Officer directly to Willis. My fiercely loyal head of corporate technology proved that leadership requires profound integrity far more than it requires a matching bloodline. Willis stabilized the international shipping routes within a month and secured our patented software behind an impenetrable digital fortress. I have stepped back entirely from the daily operational grind of the logistics empire I built from nothing. I currently serve only as a quiet senior advisor offering my perspective during quarterly board meetings or when Willis specifically requests my insight over a secure phone call. The heavy, exhausting burden of actively shielding my life's work from internal predators has completely lifted from my shoulders. I no longer spend my evenings analyzing encrypted financial ledgers or bracing for the next catastrophic betrayal from my own flesh and blood. I handed the reins to a man who respects the foundation of the company, allowing me to finally experience the true peaceful retirement I earned decades ago. The justice system processed the massive mountain of evidence we provided with terrifying speed and absolute finality. Jared is currently serving a lengthy 20-year federal sentence in a maximum security penitentiary located entirely across the country. He traded his custom-tailored tuxedos, imported scotch, and corner office views for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a sterile concrete cell. He has zero access to corporate accounts, zero offshore lifelines, and zero ability to manipulate the outside world. Rachel did not fare any better in the immediate aftermath of the raid. Her frantic, desperate attempt to flee the country was completely thwarted by our total legal seizure of her personal assets. She officially filed for absolute personal bankruptcy shortly after her husband's criminal conviction. Stripped of her stolen wealth, she quietly vanished into total obscurity, utterly rejected by the elite high society circles she once prized above human decency. The devastating ripple effects of my legal counteroffensive extended far beyond my immediate toxic family members. The ruthless offshore syndicate that had aggressively terrorized my son and threatened the survival of my company was entirely dismantled by the federal authorities. The comprehensive digital tracking evidence Willis and Mr. Bradley handed directly over to the district attorney provided the exact roadmap the government desperately needed. Federal task forces aggressively raided the syndicate's international shadow accounts, seizing hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit funds and permanently putting the lead enforcers behind bars. The highly dangerous loan sharks who had boldly parked their armored black vehicles on Jared's manicured lawn are now facing multiple decades of federal incarceration. The entire parasitic criminal network that attempted to violently feed on my hard-earned legacy has been completely and permanently eradicated from the board. The crisp, bright sunlight of Sunday morning filters beautifully through the expansive bay windows of my suburban estate. The sound of tires crunching gently on the gravel driveway no longer signals the arrival of a hostile threat or a manipulative gaslighting campaign. The front door opens and my brilliant granddaughter Haley walks into the grand foyer carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. She smiles warmly, her eyes completely clear of the heavy, suffocating trauma that nearly destroyed her wedding day exactly 1 year ago. Resting perfectly against her collarbone is Evelyn's flawless diamond necklace, catching the morning light with brilliant clarity. The toxic, poisonous shadow her parents cast over her life has completely evaporated, allowing her to step fully into her own extraordinary potential. We sit together at the kitchen island, sharing a lavish Sunday brunch filled with genuine laughter and profound mutual respect. Haley speaks passionately about her new career initiatives and the incredible life she is building alongside her husband. She does not ask me for money, she does not attempt to manipulate my emotions, and she does not view me as an expiring financial resource. Our bond has been beautifully forged in the fires of absolute truth. She recognizes the immense heavy sacrifices I made to protect the integrity of the Jenkins family name. We spend hours simply enjoying each other's company, completely free from the insidious deceit that once infected the very walls of this house. The deep, agonizing wounds of the past have beautifully scarred over, leaving behind a relationship built entirely on fierce, unconditional loyalty. The late afternoon sun begins to dip slowly behind the towering oak trees as Haley finally hugs me goodbye and drives back to the city. I step out onto my expansive back porch and ease myself into my comfortable wooden rocking chair. I hold a warm ceramic mug of strong black coffee, letting the bitter, rich aroma ground me perfectly in the present moment. I look out over the sprawling, manicured lawn and the quiet, peaceful suburban neighborhood that surrounds my secure estate. There are no medical transport vans idling at the curb, no corrupt physicians knocking on my door, and no treacherous family members plotting my demise in the shadows. The air is crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of the suffocating tension I carried relentlessly for an entire year. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, reflecting on the brutal but entirely necessary war I was forced to wage. I did not maliciously destroy my own son to satisfy a vengeful ego. I simply refused to be his victim and allowed the undeniable truth of his own actions to do its devastating work. He built the very cage he is currently locked inside. My fierce, uncompromising dignity remains completely intact. The $80 million global logistics empire I built from nothing is entirely safe and permanently shielded from parasitic greed. The toxic branches of my family tree have been surgically removed, leaving only the strong, healthy roots behind. I lean back in my chair, closing my eyes as a gentle breeze sweeps across the porch. The silence in my home is no longer a weapon. It is absolute, beautiful peace. The greatest lesson I learned is that blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty. We spend our lives sacrificing for our children, assuming they will protect us when we become vulnerable. But true family is defined by profound respect and unconditional integrity, not just a shared last name. When someone shows you their greed, believe them immediately. Never surrender your autonomy to appease toxic relatives. Protect your peace and safeguard your legacy with unwavering boundaries. If you found value in my story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments right below.